Welcome everybody to the second session of this year's Responsible Raw Materials Annual Conference. This year we're looking at the concept, or of course something that is so vital for all of us. We're looking at trust, and the title of this year's conference is Material Value Chains, the Criticality of Trust. It's so good to see many of you back here with us today, and we've got a fabulous lineup of speakers for both the first session today. So because I'm sitting in the UK, I'm going to call it the morning session, and then we have more speakers this afternoon as well. But to help you navigate through the delights of this year's conference, as always, I'm going to point you in the direction of the fabulous website, which has been updated since last year, which is very exciting. But you can still access all of the different talks, all of the different abstracts and links that we've always had within the website. Just as a reminder, Responsible Raw Materials is a not-for-profit organisation. Everything here is being done voluntary, and we're not affiliated to anybody, so we don't receive funding from any governments or any large organisations. This is purely put together because we feel it's really important to bring together anybody and everybody who has a perspective, a thought, a feeling with regards to where our raw materials come from and how we look after them. So that's the whole purpose of Responsible Raw Materials, the purpose being to bring together lots of people who might ordinarily not necessarily get the chance to speak to one another and listen to one another. So as mentioned, here is the website, and if you click on the 2023 conference and scroll down, you'll be able to find the schedule for this week's delights in terms of the different talks that we have got being given, and also discussions that will be had between many different people. I will come back to that shortly, but just to give you an overview of what we've been up to over the last few years, I'm going to click on past events. And here, this is something here where, there we go, past events, and scroll down to the bottom of the page to take you back to May 2020. Now, for, I think, almost all of us around the world, we were in something called lockdown. There was something called COVID that, of course, is still with us around the world at the moment. But this was a case when Rose had started working with myself, actually as an intern student, but that internship went out the window. And as was the case with so many organizations, we needed to pivot and find something else to do. So Rose and myself, we set up the 2020 conference for Responsible Raw Materials, and we asked the question of a fantastic array of speakers. And the question was, what does, or what should responsible raw materials actually look like? What does it actually mean? Because it means, responsibility means different things to different people. So in year one, in 2020, we explored that question and we said, yes, okay, when we are sourcing these materials, so when we're exploring for them, when we're extracting them, processing them, shipping them, recycling them, designing technology to make use of them, whatever angles we want to approach this from, be us policymakers, mining companies, anti-mining organizations, whatever the case might be, actually, we all agree that whatever happens, it needs to be done in a responsible manner. So that's what we explored in year one. And if you click on all the links that you will find here, that will take you through to the full agenda from the 2020 conference. Now, we ran a number of other events throughout the course of 2020 and early 2021. But then in May 2021, we came back together again and we said, okay, so we all agree that this thing to do with raw materials needs to be lovely and responsible, but how on earth do you do it? It's all very well saying, yes, all of these materials need to be sourced in a responsible way, etc. But how do you make this a reality? And so we hit that question head on, and you can see from the fantastic little infographic that was created on the left-hand side. And this was built during the conference by lots of people sending in suggestions as to, okay, what do some of the different tools and techniques look like and who actually uses them? We collated together a fantastic array of these tools and techniques, many of which are still, of course, being used today or have been enhanced or, of course, being used to inspire further developments of different tools, tips, tricks, and techniques to actually make ESG or sustainability a reality within the raw materials sector or sectors, because of course there are many different aspects to it. That then takes us through into last year's conference. And this was when we said, okay, so we agree that the sourcing, etc., of materials needs to be responsible. We beginning to understand how can we actually do it, because we've been sharing lots of tools and techniques. But where can this really be used? And so in 2022, what we did was we explored the question, which was, can mining be used as a mechanism through which we can unlock the just energy transition? And the inspiration for this really came from earlier on in that 12-month cycle. So in November 2021, the COP26 conference had been held in Glasgow. So that, of course, was one of the big climate conferences. And during that conference, which was fantastic, there was one very big gap. And that gap was all things raw materials. Because whilst everyone agrees, yes, we need to be able to move from non-renewable forms of power generation across to more renewable forms of power generation, where on earth are we going to get the raw materials from to build the wind turbines, the batteries, whatever else we need? And during that very big climate conference, mining wasn't welcome. And that was really interesting, because that was a case to say, okay, how are we actually going to hit these targets if we don't have available to us, or that security of supply, all of these different minerals and materials that we need? And so that was where really the inspiration for last year's conference in terms of unlocking a just transition comes from, because there's no point in going through an energy transition if we make the world a worse place or we cause an even bigger environmental disaster. So how do we make sure we go through this transition and actually leverage the fact that as a global population, we need to go through some sort of transition anyway? Can we use that as an instigator to say, how do we do this in the best possible way? And so therefore make sure that the wealth goes to where it should go, for example, rather than perhaps building on some historical problems that have been set up in the past. So that's the history of responsible raw materials. And what we have put together over the last few years are hundreds and hundreds of different talks. So if you click on the talks button, there are a number of ways of getting to it. You can see that we have got hundreds of different presentations that have been put together. And actually, if I come back to this year's conference, what we've got here is a number of the different talks that have been given to us yesterday afternoon. They're already being uploaded at the moment. So if you go into this year's conference, what you will be able to find are some of the talks that were given yesterday afternoon already being uploaded onto the website so that different people can access them at the moment. So it's very exciting in terms of what we're looking at as a whole. So if I just go back to our homepage again and find the agenda for this year's conference, this is what everything looks like for this year. So as previously mentioned, this year's topic of conversation is trust. And what we're exploring is trust throughout the minerals value chain. So we're not just looking at digging holes in the ground. We're not just looking at recycling. We're looking at these raw materials in their entirety and saying, okay, with regards to this, how do we go about creating that trust, that respect, that understanding between different stakeholders across the entirety of this value chain? And as previously mentioned, we kicked off the conference yesterday. So here you can see yesterday's lineup. So we started off with one of the UK government ministers, Minister Nusrat Ghani, and she opened the conference by giving us insight into what the UK is doing with regards to raw materials, which is really exciting because I would say, and I'm looking at Paul here because he was also part of some of these previous discussions, perhaps 2 years ago, something like that, talking about raw materials within UK government looked very different compared to what those discussions look like today. Today, there are many phone calls, there are many requests for information and understanding from individuals within the British government to better understand, okay, what is actually meant by raw materials? Where do they come from? How are they used? Where are their gaps? Where are the stresses and strains within those supply chains? And whilst I don't think anybody has all of the answers yet, the fact that people are beginning to open that dialogue and have that discussion is really, really exciting. So we kicked off by taking a look at raw materials through the eyes of government. And she didn't shy away from beginning to open the door on some of those aspects with regards to trust, because of course, in that global sphere, the different relationships between different governments, trade agreements, etc., there's a huge amount of trust that needs to be built at different levels with regards to that. The rest of the session yesterday afternoon encompassed many different aspects, including Teresa Steele-Schober and Roger Dixon giving us insight as to how sustainability is being truly incorporated into minerals governance. And of course, by incorporating those aspects, which is by no means easy, because usually it requires very different skill sets compared to your strict geoscience skill sets. By incorporating things like environment, social and governance into those mineral reporting codes, that therefore means that we're beginning to take account of those different aspects that different stakeholders feel are very important. And through that, be able to create that semblance of enhanced trust. Then across to Katie Fedosenko from one of the world's larger mining companies, who talked about, okay, from a practical perspective, what really works, but also what doesn't. And she shared some fantastic stories with us of where things have gone wrong, but also where those lessons have been learnt and they've improved on them. And so that was an aspect there of really focusing in on that word transparency. So how do you make sure that when you are sharing information with different people, it's being done in a transparent way, but also in a way that people find it easy to access, both in terms of being able to understand it, but then also being able to make use of that data. Now, in terms of understandability, which may or may not be a word, Eva Marquis then gave us a fantastic overview of what's been going on in the UN in terms of resource management systems. And so she managed to show to us a case study with regards to looking at the different georesources of Cornwall. So taking part of the UK and saying, right, let's apply this framework that's been developed at UN, so at global level, and let's apply it to a region within the UK. Does it work? Where are its strengths? Where are its weaknesses? What's its purpose? And so Eva gives a fantastic overview of the latest developments with regards to all of that. Then into the world, again, of transparency, but with regards to company structure and ownership. So Michael Barron and Tim Law gave us insight to beneficial ownership, which built on a number of talks that they'd given to us previously, which were fantastic. And then back again to the world of practicality, and Paul Hubley and George Haas talking about, okay, well, when you are working with different stakeholders, what's the network of feelings? So how can you map all those different perspectives, all the different consciousness with regards to those different individuals? And how do you say, right, okay, let's respect what's there, and then let's work out what our plan is to progress a project forwards, if indeed it should move forwards. And then finally, we went to Burkina Faso and we heard a fantastic case study with regards to artisanal gold mining and the formulation of community savings groups. So this is an environment in which very few people say have a bank account. And so therefore, if you want to borrow money to buy equipment, say for your mining activities, that can spark many problems. So this was an example here of an organization who have put a solution in place. And so we really got a look at that working in all its glory, which was fantastic. So that's what we went through yesterday, which was brilliant. And you can find all of that information already up on the website. But as you can see, we have many more talks lined up for you. And this morning's session, which is going to be started very, very shortly in approximately 5.5 minutes, Professor Paul Ekins from UCL is going to give us an insight into what he's been doing in terms of trust and sustainable development license to operate. So I know that Paul has worked with us in the past and given fantastic talks. We will post the links to Paul's previous performances in the chat as and when we get to his session. And I'm really excited actually to hear an update of Paul's latest research, because it is always absolutely brilliant. So we're going to go from Paul across to Olivia, who, despite the accent, is sitting in the UK, but she might originally be from Australia. And Olivia is going to give us insight to that world of batteries. and some of the different aspects there that we need to be aware of. So we're really looking forward to your talk. Thank you very much, Olivia. Then from Olivia in the world of batteries across to Andy Whitmore. Andy, do you want to give us a wave? Sorry, I should have been getting you guys to give us waves as we go around the agenda. Fantastic. And Andy is going to give us insight into a piece of work that his organisation that he works with, the London Mining Association and network. My apologies, Andy, the London Mining Network. And so the London Mining Network have been doing some work in Scotland, which I'm very interested in because that's where I'm originally from. And so really taking a look at some of those different aspects with regards to the transition mineral supply chains in that Scottish context. Now, after that, we're going to go to Malawi, and we've got the phenomenal Elvin. There we go. She's giving us a wave. Fantastic. And Elvin, it comes back to join us again. So she gave us a talk a little while ago, which was awesome. And Elvin's going to give us insight into Malawi's artisanal and small scale mining sector. So I am so excited to hear what you've got to say about that today. And as you can see, with all of these talks, we're coming at this concept of mineral value chains, the criticality of trust from different directions, different perspectives, which therefore enhances the dialogue that we can explore across the sector as a whole. After Elvin, we're going to hear from the fantastic Jeff Townsend, who is co-founder of the Critical Minerals Association, both here in the UK, but also globally in other areas as well. And Jeff, I'm sure, is going to be as punchy as ever and as open as ever. And he'll be exploring, okay, yeah, what does trust actually mean? And especially with regards to that world of politics as well. From Jeff, we're then going to go to Quinton Newcomb, who actually spins things around, and we're going to take a slightly different look at this whole concept of trust, because Quinton comes from a legal background. He's a judge, and we're going to explore what does trust actually mean within the legal profession. Is there anything that we can learn from that raw materials aspect? And then finally, because she's in Australia, so we decided to keep her up late at night, we're then going to go to the fabulous Namali, and we're going to explore some of those aspects with regards to trust from an Australian context. And so Namali heads up the Critical Minerals Association in Australia, and I'm so excited for us to have our conversation about that. So that's the lineup for the next few hours. I'm sure you will agree with me that it's going to be really exciting and very, very interesting. Obviously, you can watch this either through Zoom or through YouTube. If you're watching us on YouTube at the moment and you want to come and join us in the Zoom room, just follow the link that will be posted into the chat within YouTube very shortly, and you can sign up and we'll make sure that you get the link. We will be taking questions, be it in the form of the chat in Zoom or the Q&A in Zoom or the chat in YouTube or via our page on LinkedIn or any other means. If you want to send them via carrier pigeon, we will accept them. We will take all questions and use them to inform the dialogue and the discussion that we will be having here today. Let me stop sharing the screen so that you can see everybody's wonderful faces. So today's session, we will be building on what we discussed yesterday, really exploring what is this thing called trust? Where is it perhaps broken within the raw material sector? But then also, where are the opportunities to improve that? And actually, is trust even the right word? Is that what we should be aiming at as well? So with that, I'm just looking to the team that's sitting behind me. Are we all okay and ready to go? Fabulous. Okay, so we're going to hit record for the rest of the session, which is great. And I'm going to welcome to our virtual stage. I'm going to welcome to our virtual stage Professor Paul Ekins from University College London. Paul, I'm going to stop talking because everybody's heard too much from me already today, and I'm going to pass the platform straight across to yourself. So everybody, please put your hands together for the fabulous Paul. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Sarah. Impossible to have too much of you, I would say. So, and that's a very nice summary of where you've got to over the last day, and indeed over the past few years. Let me start by saying where I'm coming from, because I think that's always helpful. I'm Professor of Resources and Environmental Policy, so I'm interested in practically anything to do with sustainable development. But it's very recently that I got into the minerals and raw materials area. I became a member of UNEP's International Resource Panel, which is a group of about 30 experts worldwide who look into all manner of resources and seek really to be the resource equivalent of the IPCC or the Biodiversity Panel IPBES. And I was a co-author on the IRP report that was published in 2020 called Mineral Resource Governance. And we were looking at how the extraction of minerals around the world proceeds from a governance perspective, who runs it, who benefits from it, and how can it be improved. I think the first thing I learned from that was that it's very difficult to make generalizations, because practically any generalization you come up with, there are exceptions. So everything I say in these 10 minutes, that should be borne in mind, that there will be exceptions to what I say. But I think what I'm going to say is broadly right. And I learned that trust is indeed really important in the extraction of minerals, but that it is in very, very short supply. And that's because trust, it became obvious to me, is built on one or both of two foundations. It's either built on shared interest. In other words, you trust each other because it's better for you to trust each other than not, and you trust that the other person, other party, other stakeholder will deliver because they know your interest is built on that, and you know their interest is built on that. Or you trust each other because of deeply shared values. And I'm going to look very briefly at both those possible sources of trust in the few minutes that I've got. And as I say, the IRP report made it very clear that there's not a lot of this commodity about. And whether you look at mining companies or host governments or local communities, by and large, they don't trust each other. By and large, each of the other is looking to get as much as they can for themselves out of this particular arrangement, and they all feel that the others are getting more than their fair share. And indeed, I became aware of a term called unequal exchange, which is that perception that you're in an exchange relationship which isn't working for you in a fair way. And too often it became clear that mining companies do not respect local communities' legitimate interests, that host governments do not respect mining companies' financial imperatives. And the result is that there is a kind of three-way mistrust, mutual suspicion, very often leading to conflict. It's interesting that what Sarah was saying earlier, a lot of emphasis was clearly given to transparency. And to me, that is always the number one precondition for any kind of trust to be built. In my most recent work for the International Resource Panel, I've been looking at the most recent or last year's version of the Responsible Mining Index, which seems to me to be a pretty good piece of research work at the level at which it needs to be conducted, namely at the site level. And what becomes very apparent if you look at that splendid piece of work is that many companies are trying, but there is enormous room for improvement across whichever aspect of sustainable development you care to look. And a particularly interesting way of presenting the data from that report was that by and large, most companies on the index that they'd constructed scored less than 50%, or most sites scored less than 50% across these various dimensions. If all the companies had performed on each dimension according to the best practice that some companies had achieved on their sites, then the overall score would have gone up from below 50% to above 80%. And that seems to me to show the scope of what is possible, because those were performances that were actually being achieved in real life mining situations. Coming back then to this, the possibility of building trust on these deeply held shared values, where might that come from? I think where we are at the moment, and this is what we discovered in the IRP's resource governance report, was that we're sort of at the social license to operate stage, which I would characterize as a more or less grudging acceptance by mining companies that they have to pay rather more attention than perhaps they always have in the past to the legitimate aspirations of host countries and local communities if they want to mine without conflict. And this conflict, of course, is very evident. You've only got to look at the Environmental Justice Atlas on the web to see just how many mining-related conflicts there are around the world. But very often this social license to operate, or the attempt to gain that, does not build trust. As I say, it comes across as a kind of grudging acceptance by the different parties, but the suspicions remain, and so often do the conflicts. And we tried to move on in our report to a much deeper concept, which we called the Sustainable Development License to Operate, in the hope that this might provide a basis for the shared values on which all stakeholders could move forward. And this goes beyond the social license to operate, because it entails a commitment all round to contribute to the sustainable development of local communities, full transparency, information about the operations from companies, and to give credibility to this commitment that they are indeed walking the talk and doing what they say they're intending to do, and sharing the value creation in minerals extraction with the host country, with the local communities, in a way that's recognized as fair, both nationally and locally, respects local values and rights, protects local environments, and entails the use of resources by host governments that promote sustainable development. And again, we're all aware of governments in which sustainable development doesn't appear to be a very strong notion. And we were encouraged in our belief that this might be possible to move towards that kind of shared perception of value by, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, universally agreed at the UN level, and have generated an enormous amount of momentum towards sustainable development in many, many countries, and could provide the basis for deeply held shared values out of which trust might emerge. So that was sort of 2020. And since then, I've been involved in another piece of work for the IRP, looking at the financing of minerals extraction, particularly in the context of these things called critical minerals. And Sarah mentioned right at the beginning, how that debate has emerged. And there are really two important elements to this criticality. The first is that those countries that have now got legally mandated decarbonization targets recognize that if they are to meet those targets, they're going to have to get access to these minerals on a historically unprecedented scale and level for the decarbonizing technologies that Sarah referred to right at the beginning. But secondly, we're now in a very, very different world geopolitically to the one that we were in before the pandemic, and a recognition that the supply chains through which these critical minerals go are incredibly complex, and they go through many different countries and many different places, not all of which are friendly to various different countries for different purposes. And obviously that was brought home to us by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and sudden realization just how dependent we were for a number of particularly energy resources in this case, but also mineral resources, non-energy mineral resources for our own economic well-being. So that gives the developed world, in which, of course, many of the big mining companies are located in terms of their headquarters, that gives the developed world a huge interest in securing access to these minerals. And that really leads to two options. We can either go again to the kind of exploitative extractivism that was characteristic of the imperial era and just open another phase in that, which will be a phase of conflict, certainly, and obviously deeply unfair exchange. And it's interesting to see Andy Whitmore here, because I organized a talk at UCL just recently with Javiera Gordon, who's the Latin American coordinator of the London Mining Network. And she gave us a fantastic account, both historically of the development of the extractivist culture through imperial times, but also the danger that that extractivist culture is simply being repeated now in this new context of the need to access critical materials. Or we can go to a recognition of mutual interest, interest on behalf of the currently industrialized world, interest in securing these minerals on a secure basis, which can only be won on the basis of trust and shared interest for the sustainable development of the mining countries, both in terms of their governments and their local communities. And it's the way in which the finance sector can facilitate that's what we're currently working on at the IRP. And I've just finished the first draft of that report, so it'll be going through peer review in the course of the next few months. And I guess that's my main hope as to where this trust may eventually come from, a deeply shared mutual interest in getting access to these minerals, but a recognition that we will not manage that from the side of the industrial countries if we don't pay far more attention to shared value, to local communities, to local environments, to indigenous rights, to human rights more generally, because it's quite clear to me that the countries where these minerals are not simply going to lie back and allow them to be extracted in the kind of exploitative way which happened all too often in the past. And I'm afraid it's quite clear that it's still happening today. So in order for that to happen, there will need to be an enormous increase in capacity in many developing countries, some of which lack the basic institutions to ensure equality of exchange, the geological surveys, the mining directorates in the governments, the environmental agencies that can actually hold mining companies to account for their operations, and ensure that enough money is put aside for responsible closure. And all that is going to have to be financed by the consuming countries, which are the rich countries of the world. So minerals are not going to be as cheap as they were, and the money that is going to have to be paid for them is going to have to be used for the genuine sustainable development of the countries that supply them. And indeed, the governments that get that money will need to spend it for those purposes. And that means that the minerals themselves are going to be very different to what they have been in the past, where the mining and minerals have been characterized as sort of supreme commodities. A ton of copper is a ton of copper is a ton of copper, no matter where it comes from or how it's been produced. And that will have to change. The technology is now there for it to change in terms of traceability. And again, we come back to that absolute priority of transparency and the provision of information. So the only way in which the trust that we're looking for can be built will be on the basis of those kinds of mutual interest arrangements going forward between all the different stakeholders. So I've probably said enough, Sarah, I hope, to have stimulated some questions, either from you or from other panelists, or indeed from anyone who happens to be listening to this online.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. I personally have been scribbling away because you've been triggering all kinds of ideas as you've given us that introductory talk. So a massive round of applause to yourself. Thank you so much. So with regards to questions, and you're correct, there have been many comments flying around behind the scenes. And I think the first one is it's a question that I get asked on a regular basis, which is horrible, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway, which is everybody tends to agree and says, yes, we need to be able to move towards a system of mutual interest, so away from that exploitative extraction. And everybody agrees that, yes, this is what we need to make happen. But a lot of people then say, no, but you're deluded. It's never going to work because our capitalist system, etc., keeps on pushing forwards the fact that those mining companies, etc., need to make money for their shareholders. Now, I know that you've begun to peel back the lid on what might be coming in your report. Do you have any initial advice with regards to how do you reply to that particular question where somebody says, lovely idea, but you're deluded?
Well, let me go back to kind of the basics. I didn't say it at the beginning. I'm an economist, and so I try to understand these economic matters. And the one thing that anyone who studied environmental economics knows is that markets do this very badly. So it's even called an externality, all these environmental effects that we experience, because they're outside markets unless governments put them inside markets. And that is the crucial role of government, to ensure that these non-market effects are fully taken into account. And at the moment, of course, we don't even begin to do that. And if we start to do that in the mining industry, the first thing we will get is this decommoditization that I was talking about. And that is a fundamental reform of the market for minerals. And that will have to come about if we're going to be interested in taking these matters into account, because if a mining company produces minerals in a sustainable way and they are more expensive than the minerals of their competitors, which would be the case today, then they will go bust. They will lose their capital, their shareholders will go elsewhere, and that won't happen. We're beginning to move towards an awareness of the need to moderate market forces in this way. So the European Commission has plans for a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which seeks to take carbon into account. And we will have to have, in my view, and I must stress this is my personal view rather than the IRP, because our report hasn't yet gone through its peer review processes. In my view, we will need a raw materials adjustment mechanism to enable markets to take those things into account without getting competitively disadvantaged. And you mentioned Minister Nusrat Ghani right at the beginning. I'm afraid the UK has an appalling record in this area, because although they talk a good talk about having trade that is sustainable, and this is particularly with regard to the agricultural trade deals, which we have struck already with Australia and New Zealand, there is nothing in those trade deals that allows for standards of food production. And that's despite the fact that the government has said repeatedly that it is going to take those non-market effects into account. It simply has not done so. So it's a classic case of not walking the talk, of talking a good message, but then not putting that into effect. And until we get serious about moderating market forces in that way, then Sarah, yes, we will be deluded and we will not achieve those kinds of sustainable development processes in mining, which our Sustainable Development License to Operate idea was built on.
So if there was a group or a kind of, a stakeholder group that actually does hold a bigger lever with regards to this at the moment, would you say that that's governments rather than, say, companies or communities, etc.?
I don't think any one of those three important sets of stakeholders can do it by themselves. There are companies that want to move further and faster than they are doing in this area, but they can't because of competitive pressures. There are governments sometimes who are wedded to these kind of neoliberal ideas of free markets, which cannot solve these problems. And the local communities normally are the people with the least power. And the only power that they have is actually to engage in conflict and to stop the mining taking place. And that's what we're seeing around the world far, far too often. So this needs to be an agreement based on mutual interests, whereby the countries and the communities actually recognize what needs to be done, and the consuming countries agree to pay the price for a sustainably mined mineral, which gives a decent return to the companies that operate in that way, and the host countries and communities keep a fair value of the shared value that is being created through that process.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. So I think what we've done there is begin to see the sheer scale of the challenge and the complexities of the challenge that we're facing at the moment. And Paul, with regards to some maybe key takeaways, it's that mutual interest, that shared interest in those shared values, and people being willing to actually face up to the fact that this is going to be really, really hard in many different aspects. So everyone, please put your hands together for the fabulous Professor Ekins. Thank you very much, Paul. Round of applause. Excellent. So having teed up today's session with the fabulous Paul, what we're now going to do is we're going to move into that world of batteries. And I'm going to welcome to the stage now the fabulous Olivia, who comes to us from the wonderful organisation that is Worley. So Olivia, round of applause, and over to yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Paul. I couldn't agree more with what you were saying about the priority of transparency. And then it does come down to walking the talk, and that really needs to happen so we get the sustainable development that we need in mining and so many industries. So thank you so much for that, Paul. I am going to share my screen with you all, which hopefully you can now see. And hello, as Sarah mentioned, my name is Olivia McFarlane. I am based in London, but I don't sound like it. I'm from Australia. I came over here about 10 months ago to join Worley's Battery Materials Growth Unit, where I'm a business development manager. My team, we focus on and support our customers across the entire value chain of the battery. So this is from mining, brining, refining, to creating and recycling the best battery for tomorrow. I've joined
Olivia,
the team.
sorry, just to jump in, so we can't see your screen at the moment. There we go. It's beginning to think about it now. Beautiful. There you go.
Turns out I had to press share as well as the screen.
Amazing, isn't it? Sorry for the interruption.
There wasn't anything key. Thank you, Sarah. Anyway, so yes, I joined the team in the UK within the past year, and I was compelled by how fast-paced, innovative, fast-growing and intense the battery market is. And I also joined the team thinking, yes, batteries, that's the next big sustainable thing. That's going to help us to achieve our net zero goals and conquer this energy transition easily and save the day. I want to be part of it. Well, I quickly found out that batteries aren't all that I thought they were yet. But by adding trust and transparency in the value chain, that is where they're packed with exciting opportunities. So I would love to tell you that batteries are currently really sustainable and only great for the environment, but I'm afraid not, at least not right now. Why though? Well, long story short, batteries currently aren't as sustainable as you think they are. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of what it takes from mining the battery to a battery, but essentially what I want you to understand is that the journey, the raw materials take from mine to becoming an active material that then gets put into a battery is extremely energy intensive, often done under poor working conditions. It involves transporting the materials from one part of the globe to the other and undergoing extreme refining and processing, such as heating up the raw materials to the temperature of the sun for 2 weeks. So yeah, it's not that sustainable currently. When I talk about transporting them across the globe, let's look at where batteries are ending up. So here you can see the spread in demand for EVs globally. The end of the value chain is the demand center for batteries and recycling these, and it is largely driven by the demand for electric vehicles. Of this global demand, you can see it's grouped into 3 main regions: East Asia, Europe, and North America. And you can see the tremendous growth in demand that is forecasted, that is being driven, that's being driven by many strong influences, such as government and policies driving uptake in EVs, the cost of EVs decreasing, society is making EVs more socially acceptable and attractive to consumers, and the technology of batteries is improving. Now, what about the other end of the value chain? Particularly the anode and cathode materials, which make up over 60% of the value chain. If we do a bit of high school chem, battery is made up of anode, cathode, electrolytes. So the cathode and anode, if we want to go into that more, then reach out to me after, or pop a question in the chat. But the cathode and the anode are made up of raw materials, with the most common today being lithium, nickel, manganese, and cobalt for the cathode, and graphite for the anode. Altogether, they go into making what you would have probably heard of, a lithium-ion battery. And forecasts indicate that lithium-ion batteries will be the standard solution for EVs over the next 10 years or so. Now, let's look at where these raw materials are located and coming from compared to where they're ending up. So remember this graph, and then, yeah. As you can see, where the minerals for the lithium-ion batteries are is not where the demand for EVs, aka the end market, sits. So we've got this massive disconnect. For example, 40% of lithium is coming from Australia. The majority of cobalt is coming out of Africa, but neither of these countries have large end markets for EVs. Then, alternatively, you have Europe, which accounts for more than 1/4 of worldwide EV assembly, but home to very little of the supply chain. So now we have the problem that either ends of the supply chain are vastly disconnected. Raw materials are having to be transported across the globe to get to their final destination. And through the process of going from mine to becoming an active material, we are losing visibility of what's actually happening to the materials, making it very hard to track how truly sustainable they are by the time the materials get to being in a battery. This slide here shows the value chain on a graph, and this is what I've been talking about when I say from mining, brining, refining, all the way on the far left to the opposite end where it comes to EV manufacturing and recycling. I won't go into the nitty-gritty of this in just looking at the time, but essentially what is important to know is that we've got either ends of the value chain at fixed locations. We know we can't change the mines, the location of the mines. The minerals are where they are. Also know that we can't change the location of the EV manufacturing facilities because we've got traditional, internal combustion engine manufacturing facilities transitioning their facilities into EV manufacturing facilities. So they are where they are. Then we've got the battery manufacturing and the recycling plants co-locating around EV manufacturing facilities. And that is due to transporting it from battery manufacturing, the safety of it and the ease of it being better if it's nearby, and recycling legislation is driving that to be done in the countries where the EV manufacturing is happening. So we're left with this small part of the value chain, which you can see in the navy blue. But in real life, this is actually very opaque, what is happening in this part of the value chain. And what I mean by this is this part of the value chain is currently where we are seeing the materials be transported to another area of the world for refining and processing, and we're losing visibility of what's happening to them until they come back to usually the west and to the fixed locations at the other end of the value chain. So once the raw materials go to those areas, we don't know what happens to them for the conditions they're refined under, the carbon that is being emitted to process them, and more. For example, a lot of the time they're going to China when they're going to the refined intermediate stage. And most of the Chinese graphitization and anode manufacturing occurs in remote areas where energy prices are low, where coal-fired power plants are abundant. Additionally, some of the mining that occurs for the raw materials is done in poorer countries, and it's not always to the expected Western standards. But we can't track or know this for sure, and that is why we need transparency. Everyday consumers are expecting to see exactly where things have come from, so they can see and understand how sustainable a product is and what impact there was to produce it. So at the moment, there's no price tag on ESG, and my suggestion is that we need to redefine and broaden the definition of value to include more than just the economic value, but instead also include all the ESG considerations of how minerals flow through the entire value chain. Now, unfortunately, in the capitalist society, we measure everything on the bottom line, which is made up of capex spent to get something up and going, plus the amount made through operations. There isn't much extra value associated, with how green or sustainable a product is, and it is therefore currently not economically feasible for people to charge more for ESG considerations. This needs to change, and as Sarah said in the intro, we need to make ESG a reality. We need to put a price on the entire ESG value of a battery, and consumers need to be willing to pay. But this will require all parts of the value chain to become more transparent so consumers can trust and be willing to pay this extra price. Governments can provide funding to stimulate the industry, and we've seen that in America that has done this really well by putting money into the economy to get things going. But the longer term and more sustainable way to make this happen needs to come from the everyday consumer, accepting that we need to pay more for a more sustainable vehicle. Ultimately, consumers need to accept that there is a price for delivering a more sustainable world. The problem is we're used to getting things cheap, although if it comes cheaper, it often isn't done. It is often doing more harm, than good. With, for instance, the battery making process being powered by coal and coming from a value chain that is opaque to track, but coming with a cheaper price tag. So essentially, I want to end on is the question to you guys. Is our consumer society willing to pay a premium to accelerate sustainability? So I would like to end on this. How much more would you be willing to pay for an EV? And did you just think of a dollar value? Or did you think of a value that included a transparent supply chain of the EV that has been made with reduced carbon emissions and from sustainable sources of raw materials in socially acceptable conditions and more? What about if you could trust and see the whole value chain transparently? Combating climate change does not come for free, and I think it's time we stop expecting it to. And with that, Sarah, that is the end of my presentations. Maybe a few questions have come in. I see I've stopped.
Fantastic.
Now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Olivia. That was truly brilliant. I'm going to steal some of those diagrams, if I may, with regards to not only where the end users tend to be based, also where the materials tend to come from, and then also what is fixed and what could be moved in terms of that geographical location, in terms of where certain tasks take place. So everyone, please put your hands together for the fabulous Olivia. Fantastic. Excellent. Now, Olivia, what you were saying there, I think builds beautifully on what Paul was saying in terms of how do people actually value where these materials come from. And I think that the pointing towards it's not just about the financial value, but the other forms of value as well. Is that correct? So it's again looking for value in things like people and planet, not just the money side. Is that correct?
Yeah. So at the moment, as I said, we're measuring, we're putting the value on batteries and a lot of things just with the bottom line. We're not considering all that they go through, and consumers, we're just used to getting things cheaply. And if we can, but we need to recognize that this isn't all going to happen without us paying a bit more. We can't rely on policies which will help. Governments can put money into this and incentivize it, but it's not the long-term sustainable solution that is going to help us achieve our sustainability goals. So yeah, we need to broaden and define and get used to a different value that includes, which will correlate to a higher price tag, but that is a price tag that will help us achieve a more sustainable world, a more economical and social, and all improved economical, social, and governance.
Thanks, Olivia. I've got a question that's just come in to say, okay, great. So we might just have to accept the fact that if we want to do this right, then it's going to cost us as the end consumer more money. But how does this stack up with regards to the cost of living crisis that many people are facing at the moment? So when you've got people who are in this world of tension saying, I don't actually have any more money, but I want to be able to carry on living in the way that I've become accustomed. Do you have any thoughts with regards to how do you address that tension?
If I had all the answers, I would be working it out myself. But I mean, I think that comes down to changing habits. I think that we're used to having so much. The consumer society, we're used to being able to get the next new thing. It's just about reusing a lot of what we've already got. We don't have to have the next new thing always. If you can't afford it, maybe just, reuse what you've got rather than demand and buy the next new iPhone, or use the iPhone 14, I guess. But yeah, the cost of living is putting a lot of pressures and making it hard to accept the increase in price tags for paying for a more sustainable product. But I guess that's where we need to actually look at what we're prioritizing. And this is really needing to happen as a priority. We're at a ticking time bomb now.
And so with this, and thanks as well for the questions, by the way, that are coming in behind the scenes. Do you see, because this is a monumental challenge, do you see this as something that is terrifying or actually really exciting in terms of the change that we need to go through over the next few years?
Exciting.
I would never have guessed that, Olivia.
Exciting. I was talking to Dr. Paul Ebert, who is the head of the energy transition at Worley, and he was like, you're about to go into an extremely exciting part of your career. The amount of changes that are about to happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years that people my age, I'm 24, we are going to witness and be part of, it's going to be immense. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know the technologies and the changes that are going to happen. The technologies of today aren't going to be the ones that save the world tomorrow, but being part of the creation and seeing those actually get put into play and how they play out, it's going to be really, really cool. It's going to be a challenge, but we have got some of the greatest minds to work on it. So I think it's very exciting, Sarah.
I'm with you now. I'm slightly older than 24, but I too am very excited with regards to what we're looking at. And I love the phrase you just came out with there, which is the technologies of today are not going to be the technologies that are going to solve the challenges of tomorrow. I think that that's fantastic and just shows that innovation, creativity, etc., is where it's at in terms of what needs to happen. Now, I've got one final question for you that's come in from Pip. And she asks, is there a sustainable way to recycle batteries yet? I don't think we should be churning out things that we can't recycle. How is that sustainable? What do you reckon?
like batteries, they're good. They can be improved. Long story short, there is ways to recycling, but they are improving and they do need to be improved. It's a journey that we're going on. Legislation is making it demanding for it to become more sustainable, but it is an energy intensive process currently. We could be recycling a lot more and getting back a lot more from the final product that we're recycling. So yeah, we're on a journey with recycling. This whole energy transition, it's a journey, and it needs to be improved, is a long story short, but it's better than doing nothing. And we need to be doing it.
Loving it. So technologies of tomorrow, be optimistic and excited about everything that we're looking at. And it's a journey, but we're better than doing nothing. Fabulous. So with that, Olivia, thank you so much. Your insight has been fantastic. Round of applause, everybody, for the fabulous Olivia McFarlane. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thanks, mate. Cool. So moving from that wonderful world of batteries and the excitement, of course, of that world to the one and only Andy Whitmore. So Andy, I'm going to invite people to put their hands together for a round of applause for your wonderful self and hand over the spotlight to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share. Truly appreciate it. Get back to the start of my presentation. No, I really enjoy these sessions and I really enjoy the interaction, and I hope what I'm going to say now builds both on what Paul and Olivia have said. I certainly feel it does, but apologies, I may need to disappear earlier because of work pressures. So if I disappear from the panel, I'm very sorry, but I will try to stay on because I want to carry on the engagement. I mean, I'm glad you've chosen trust to talk about as the main theme. I think for London Mining Network's work with mine affected communities, trust is a huge issue for us, I think, as Paul raised in his talk. I think historically, I would say the concerns we've been pushing have been pretty much on the fringes of the debates and policies. I think gradually that's changing, and very grateful for the community partners we work with that have helped to push it on the agenda. But I think we've still got some way to go. And interestingly, one of the things I would say is that in the debates around UK critical minerals, many of the voices that we represent still aren't able to reach government through advisory panels, etc., which is something that various NGOs had written a joint letter on. And I think we won't get that trust unless we're kind of at the table talking as well. So I think we've still got some way to go. As mentioned, I'm co-chair of London Mining Network, and I also facilitate our Just Transition Working Group. But this year, I've presented before more generally on our work around transition minerals and just transition, but I particularly wanted to focus on an opportunity that's come up. This is a report that we've written for Friends of the Earth Scotland. It's actually me as an individual doing this as a researcher, but the work very much ties into London Mining Network. And I think it really does build on the previous kind of arguments I've made. Important to stress, the report has still got to be published. It's going to be launched on the 31st of May. So I'm very grateful to Friends of the Earth Scotland for allowing me to talk about it, to give you a bit of a taster. And also for commissioning the report itself, and for my colleague Jake and I to work on it. Particular thanks to Kim Pratt at Friends of the Earth Scotland for the input she's made, because unfortunately I'm not an expert on Scottish policy. So if questions come in on that, I may end up having to pass to her. I would say just before I start, last point, as I think the conclusions on this are fairly radical. When I say building on what's been said, I think we're pushing it in an even more radical direction. And I think the reasons for that is that the Scottish government has legislation coming up that kind of provides opportunities, and I think has a slightly different position from the UK government in general, which I'll explain. But also, I think there's a fundamental argument we're making here around the material demands for an energy transition and the changes we need to make. And I think the trust that's kind of required in that, which I'll obviously come back to when I finish. So for me, in terms of what the report was covering, we were looking primarily to aiming to raise awareness of what transition minerals are, particularly their environmental and social impacts. So looking across the entire supply chain, I know that that's clearly, many people here will be aware of that, but in trying to focus decision makers, it's a good idea to be as clear on those issues as we can. Their essential role in Scotland's energy transition, and then finally, how supply chain justice and demand reduction is going to reduce any of those harmful impacts within the supply chain. We chose 2 specific transition minerals. We looked through a whole range of different criteria, and in the end, we chose lithium and steel. Lithium because we wanted to concentrate on battery mineral, on something that was a lower volume, but in some ways kind of obviously essential for the energy transition. And steel was an unusual one. We were looking at bulk materials and we were trying to choose between copper and steel. And in the end, chose steel, particularly because of the importance it will have in Scotland's offshore wind energy provision. So, and it was an unusual choice. I mean, we wanted to focus more on the human rights impacts, the environmental injustice impacts than criticality. And I think that's a key point we make in this report, is that very often copper and iron and steel, aren't considered an energy transition mineral, a critical mineral in government strategy, because criticality is looking about, whether we'll run out of it, whether there's going to be bottlenecks in the supply chain. But we would argue that both copper and steel, are effectively essential for the energy transition. So they have huge impacts along the supply chain. So it depends where you're looking at it from the issue of criticality, or maybe from the issue of it just in the transition itself. And in the report, we map out the supply chains of both going towards Scotland, although it's quite difficult because the data is very often not disaggregated. And we've chosen case studies to exemplify key issues along the supply chain. Chile and Australia, who are the main suppliers of lithium. Australia particularly, because I think we wanted to point out that there are also issues in hard rocks mining for lithium. It's not just brine mining from the likes of Chile that are often highlighted. And then also for steel, Brazil particularly, and then smaller case studies from both Canada and Turkey. So the context of why we chose Scotland, there are various legislative opportunities that had come up. The first one is Scotland's climate change plan, which, although fairly radical, kind of lays out strategies for decarbonisation, but it doesn't feature transition minerals. So we obviously wanted to add that in. Also, when it's looking at emission targets, it really tends to ignore them from imports, which obviously is fairly key in issues like transition minerals. So we wanted to make sure that in any future legislation, these issues were taken into consideration. There's also the energy transition and just transition plan they have, where consultations have just started. But so far, there's been little reference to the idea of these transition minerals and materials that will be required. So again, opportunities to insert into that. A national planning framework, which lists just transition as one of its key principles and talks about the need for a circular economy. So gives us perhaps more of an opening than within the UK government in these issues. And then finally, and most importantly, a circular economy bill, which is just being debated, is moving through the process at the moment, and there's a huge opportunity to create a materially just and sustainable economy, which sets targets towards that. Within that, we focus very much on this issue of demand reduction. So there are various ways across the supply chain, many of which have been discussed in both this conference and previous conferences. But in many ways, the best way to actually reduce any impacts, any negative impacts, is likely to be by reducing demand. So for one example, we look at the idea of what a transition will mean and different paths to decarbonisation. And in one piece of research we include into the report, we note that if the proportion of bus journeys in Scotland was just increased by 30%, then the lithium requirements required for travel for all sorts of vehicles would be 32% less. So again, it's coming down to question, what an actual transition means in practice. How much of that the materials are going to be required for individually owned electronic vehicles, and then what policies you may need in order to shift that. And also, particularly around recycling, we just mentioned the issue of recycling rate for lithium. It's only 1% at the moment. Again, there are opportunities, despite the difficulties, to increase that and maybe to have an industry based around that. But I think particularly for steel, Scotland has a lot of oil rigs, a lot of wind turbines that are going to effectively need to be recycled. At the moment, a lot of its scrap is actually exported, and in theory, it could be using the energy from offshore wind in electric arc furnaces, in furnaces that are going to be as non-polluting as possible, to build an industry that's focused on scrap steel. So then, again, whistle-stop tour of the report, but the conclusions are basically what we've asking for is the idea of resource justice strategy for Scotland. Again, I think what governments have tended to have is a critical minerals strategy and critical minerals policies. And clearly, criticality is important, but I think that takes a focus just purely on those issues of criticality, of ensuring supply, demand, etc., of making sure that bottlenecks are sorted. Whereas, we believe, and we're arguing that the issues around the impacts of the supply chain should have at the least equal, if not more, importance. So within that, you get the idea of a plan for a fair and sustainable consumption of transition minerals. And this, the resource strategy itself, the idea would be to ensure that Scotland's consumption of materials is, where possible, sustainable and just as possible. And in order to do that, our argument is that it needs to be guided by statutory and science-based consumption reduction targets. So the idea that we need to set some sort of targets to try and reduce consumption within northern countries, in this case within Scotland. So we come up with lots of recommendations which are fairly detailed, but in the time I've got, I will just say that the key points are that we talk about 5 pillars of it. So the first is a commitment to a globally just material transition. So, and within that, the idea that it does no harm, which is something that's already come up in discussions that groups have had in Scotland around the mineral transition and what a just transition is, but also including due diligence, environmental and human rights due diligence guidance for Scotland, because obviously there's limited powers within Scotland, but also asking the Scottish government to lobby the UK government for legally binding due diligence. The creation of consumption reduction targets, as mentioned, which could be both carbon-based and material-based consumption targets, and then have policies to ensure that that demand reduction is in. I think it's important to have the targets, but we're not talking about some sort of Soviet kind of imposition. The idea is to bring people with you. The idea is that it needs to be sold that actually this is a positive thing. And so you need to, first of all, to ensure that people believe this is going to be a positive thing. And then second of all, to come up with strategies around industry, etc., which are going to move towards setting goals that will assist in this, both in terms of extra recycling, circular economy, but similar to and including the suggestion earlier with regard to recycling of steel. Then clear and transparent data, because one of the issues that we came up with, I mentioned briefly earlier, was the difficulty of actually getting data and ensuring that it was disaggregated and understanding exactly how it was going to, how exactly worked. And then finally, a fair and collaborative policy process. So the idea of ensuring that there is buy-in and discussion from all of the different groups within it in terms of creating policy. So that's a whistle-stop tour. I hope you'll get a chance to read it. But I think in conclusion, the key point is, if this is going to happen, it's going to need a big leap of faith and thinking. There's a definite shift in how we're going to consider our own consumption. And I think in order to do that, we need to create trust. If we're going to move this forward in a reasonably short time scale that is required for the energy transition, then I think we've got to both explain why it's necessary and then explain how it's a positive change. And I think that those are the biggest challenges we've got. And I think both of those challenges really require trust from the general public. So I will stop there and happy to take, obviously, any questions or thoughts you've got.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andy. Everyone, round of applause for the fabulous Andy Whitmore. Excellent. That was brilliant. And I really love the fact that we're focusing in on that Scottish context, because of course, from a United Kingdom perspective, Scotland is one of the bits, but there's a whole load of tension and perhaps trust on a knife's edge with regards to all of that as well. So Andy, again, I've got a number of questions that have come in for you here, but I'm going to start with one of my own, because there was a statistic that you used in terms of the buses. So was that a case of if the use of buses went up by 30%, then the demand for lithium would go down by 31% or something like that?
32%, yes.
32%. Yeah. And so I think, okay, that right there is genius, because within the Scottish context, the number of bus services and routes, so effectively the amount of bus availability has gone through the floor over the last few years, primarily because it all stopped during COVID and it hasn't come back again. So is that something where actually and the Scottish government, that is something that you'd have thought could be pretty simple for the government to address? Is that something there where it's a really tangible action that could be looked at beyond, of course, your fantastic 5-point plan at that more policy level? What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we need to approach it from two levels. I think I would argue we need these bigger ideas. I mean, a lot of what I've just said there are almost potentially mind-blowing ideas. I mean, over time, I mean, I've started working with communities and focused on communities' rights. And I think eventually that's led me and many others as well to start thinking, well, how much of this is driven by our consumption? So I've ended up being quite influenced by what's often known as the degrowth movement. So the idea that we need to question growth. And those are huge ideas. And I think they're coming from lots of different angles and people are arguing it in different ways. And I don't actually like the term degrowth because, again, I think it's seen as negative. You know, I want to see it as much more this idea of promoting the idea of well-being. And they're essential for this idea of what sort of transition we want. So those are huge ideas. But at the end of the day, we also need to move forward with practical suggestions. So I think that's why we wanted to give that sort of suggestion of increasing public transport. I mean, we've had policy shifts in this government in general that are, have taken away from the idea of using public transport and put much more focus on individual vehicle ownership. And those are policy decisions that we often accept, but we don't necessarily need to accept, but I think are relatively easy to change. But relatively easy to change, I think, as well, if we explain kind of what the purpose is of it, what need is of it, and what the benefits are of it. I think, there will definitely be downsides. I mean, I own a vehicle because I have to own a vehicle because of where I live, how I live. But I mean, I want to move towards, I've done my best to own a vehicle which is non-polluted, etc. But I want to move towards having a government that has policies that allows us to ensure that public transport takes away my need for a vehicle.
Yeah, and I have to say that I think my family will be well and truly on that bus with you. Excuse all the puns with regards to that. Now, I know that Ludovine has got something that she wants to chip in with here. So Ludovine, do you want to chip in with your question? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. It was a little bit of a comment, Andy. I don't know if you spotted this, but the EU announced its CRM Act on mid-March, and it is at the moment the only narrative where I've actually heard the word credibility being linked to demand reduction and demand management. Credibility of expectations being conditioned by the fact that there are significant changes in consumption and usage. It's not part of the main narrative, but you can definitely spot it in some of the Commission's position statements to date. So I think this is where we're going. I think beyond policy choices, there are some major social choices to be made, and those demand huge political capital. Political capital is a form of trust, and I want to, as usual, agree with Professor Ekins, who says, it's probably the resource that's the most rare here. So thank you for contributing by showing that it can be done.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Yeah, no, I have been aware and I have been following, and I think the European Parliament has put forward various proposals around this, and I think that's what's often filtering into European policy. And I think it's some of the more advanced in terms of the thinking around this, which is great, which is absolutely necessary. We still feel a little bit like it's voices in the wilderness to an extent. But then I think, you've also got to remember that, it wasn't that long ago that Milton Friedman, that Hayek, the people who created neoliberalism, were sitting in their rooms trying to come up with this brilliant idea that no one had really heard of, and that they then had to push against this idea of Keynesianism, which was the dominant thinking. And now, of course, we're in a position where neoliberalism in the West is generally the dominant thinking, and they did that over a period of decades. Maybe we need to move faster, but I think there's a definite perception that people are starting to consider this. And I think it's partly because it's just over 50 years ago since the Limits to Growth was produced. But now, if you look at the graphs, and I think previously I've presented and shown a graph of the material consumption. I'm sure plenty of other people over time and at different conferences have done it. Yeah, and I know, I think that means our argument is fundamentally we're in a material crisis. It's not just a carbon crisis. That actually, if you look at the vast amounts that are being produced, they're going up, and I don't think it's just a spike to do with a move towards the energy transition. That's part of it. I think we will eventually globally, and obviously this is mainly a problem of the global north rather than the south, but globally need to consider the amount of materials that we use. But yeah, thanks for that comment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ludovine. And thank you so much again, Andy. So we look forward to the launch of the formal report on the 31st of May. Was that correct? 31st
of May, yes. Yeah. So, and I will send a link through, and hopefully you'll be able to put the link through to the report and the launch when ready.
Yeah, no, that would be awesome if you could send that through. So everybody, please put your hands together for the wonderful Andy Whitmore. Thank you very much. Thanks, Andy. Fantastic. So we're going to go from sunny Scotland. And of course, I say that with a huge degree of sarcasm because it's maybe sunny for like 2 days a year in Scotland. And we're going to go to Malawi, where it's perhaps a little bit sunnier. And I'm very, very delighted to welcome to our virtual stage the wonderful Elevin. So Elevin, over to yourself. Round of applause. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. And hello, everyone. I am Elevin from Malawi, the warm heart of Africa, and I would like to welcome you to the warm heart of Africa. I hope you can all hear me and you can also see my screen. So let me start by introducing myself. I work for Export Development Fund, but I am a member of the Nyasa Mining Cooperative, and also I work with Malawi Women in Mining. I work in collaboration with Malawi Women in Mining. So today I'm going to share about building trust from the source to the market, which is something that is quite key for us as Export Development Fund. So just to share a bit of context, Export Development Fund, it's an institution or it's a company that is formed under the Reserve Bank of Malawi, and with the main interest of generating or supporting generation of forex or foreign currency in the country. So one of the initiatives that we're doing is to buy gold and gemstones from artisan small-scale mining under the precious metals and minerals. So that's why you see that today I'm wearing a hat of Export Development Fund. Those of you that remember me 2 years ago, I came in as a Nyasa Mining Cooperative, but I also have a background or history of working with Oxfam, ActionAid, mainly under the mining governance. So now I've fully transformed into artisanal and small scale mining. So maybe you may be wondering that why is Malawi interested in artisanal small scale mining? It's because for a long time, people have been mining gemstones, beautiful gemstones. In my next slide, I'll show you just a few of the gemstones that we have in Malawi. We have aquamarine, we have sapphire, we have tourmalines, we have rhodolite garnet, and ruby. So these gemstones, they are quite of high value. And unfortunately, most of these have been smuggled out of the country because there was no proper, or there was no formal market for marketing these gemstones. And unfortunately, as I think I presented also in my last presentation, last 2 years ago, most of these gemstones, they're exported in their rough form, of which now value it's not really reflected, unlike if they were to be value added, like in the other photos that you can see. Malawi also has a good number of low value gemstones, which we call them the colored stones, that in their raw form they would not mean a lot. If you can see in that slide, the pink stones down there, the picture down there, that's the raw form of rose quartz. But if you do some tumbling and value addition, you see that there's also some value that is added to it. So us as Export Development Fund, we're exploring different opportunities of exporting gemstones in rough, but most importantly in value-added form, so that we can help generate forex for the country. Why is this very crucial to us? Malawi as a country now does not have so many products that it is exporting, but we demand a lot of products from outside the country. So our foreign currency reserves are quite low. For example, in the past few years, we've experienced shortage of drugs, shortage of vaccine. Apparently, we're experiencing shortage of fuel. We have to, it's unfortunate, we have to be on the queue for about 3-4 hours just to fuel up your car. So these are the serious challenges that we're facing as a nation. So as Export Development Fund, we're aggressively looking for opportunities to generate forex for the country so that we can meet the basic needs for Malawians. Hence our passion, or even hence my passion in seeing that the mineral resources or the gemstones indeed contribute positively. So today I'm going to talk about generating trust, because for us to be able to penetrate into the market for gold and gemstones, we need to build trust. The first aspect is to look at the source. In the first photo here, you can see a local woman who is panning gold for her to earn a living. So if you're building trust, you look at different levels. What is my interest? What is the interest of the people that I'm reaching out to? And what is the interest of the country? So for example, I'll use the case of this woman. This woman, her interest or her basic need is for her to meet the needs or the demands of our household. So what do we do as Export Development Fund to make sure that we meet her needs? Do we have the right policies in the country that will help this woman to meet her needs? Do we have the right environment that will protect this woman to meet her needs? I'm raising all this because most of the times when you talk about artisanal and small-scale mining, people think about people, they think that it's a criminal, it's something criminal, it's bad, it's illegal. Can you please go and arrest these people because they are illegally mining? But look at this woman, she's doing this so that she can find food for the day. In my role as a manager for the precious metals and minerals under Export Development Fund, we have visited these women several times, and when we are buying gold from them, the moment we buy 1 gram, which is 1 gram, it translates into about, we buy them at almost $60. But it's also rare for her to find a gram when she works the whole day. She'll find 1 fraction of a gram. So you see her only getting $6. And when the moment she gets the $6, immediately she goes to the nearby market to buy food for her children, and then she takes that to the house. So how do we build trust that this woman should come and sell her gold to us, unlike the illegal traders? So through our participation in the market, as Export Development Fund, we started buying gold from artisanal and small-scale miners in May 2021, and after the president said mandated us to start buying gold. When we started buying, the illegal traders or the foreigners, they were buying from these women at a price of $20 per gram. We started by introducing a price of $35 per gram. Immediately, the illegal traders, they raised their price to $40,000 per gram. We tried to increase it to $45,000 per gram. The illegal traders were buying from them at $50 per gram. We then eventually went to $55 per gram against the international price of $60 per gram at that time. And you could see that the illegal traders were buying at $60 to $65 per gram. All they were trying was to block Export Development Fund not to buy from the artisan small-scale miners. I can say that somehow they were achieving, but on the other hand, I personally was now happy that people are able to see the true value of the minerals that they were buying. So for us coming into the market, there was a lot of negative narrative that the government is promoting buying of gold from the illegal miners, referring to these women. But in actual sense, it is the foreigners and the middlemen that were illegal in this process, and they were blocking us. So building trust was not easy, but eventually after 6 months, the communities appreciated the efforts of Export Development Fund, because now they saw the actual value of gold when now they were being bought at $60 per gram. And most of these, they could also opt not to sell to those that are offering them higher prices, but still came to us because they saw that EDF has helped to review, Export Development Fund has helped to review the actual value of the mineral. So all I'm trying to say here is that building trust in the mining communities is not easy. It takes time, but you still have to be patient. You're going to meet a number of obstacles, but you don't give up, because we're looking at what are the needs of these people that we are trying to reach out to these women that we're trying to reach out to. And this code, when you take it from the locals and it goes through all the value chain up to the end user, will the end user be happy to hear the story of where that gold or gemstone was coming from? Or it's something very pathetic that they will now feel bad that there were rights that were abused, there were so many things that happened along the way. And also just to mention that when we're coming into this sector, there were a lot of abuses to women that were happening at that time. Others, they were not being paid fairly. Others, they were being sexually harassed or even exploited and all those things. And we came in trying to promote responsible sourcing. So, however, we don't rule out the participation of the middlemen. So in the third photo, you can see that those are women in mining, the women that you not find actually at the mine, but they are also in the value chain. So we also look at the needs of such kind of women that, okay, how are they participating in the value chain? They are sourcing from the locals, they will act as middlemen, and they'll also sell to Export Development Fund. It is good for us also to work with this category of people, because they help us to reach the bigger volumes faster, because they are willing to be on the ground for longer days, of which maybe sometimes us with our capacity we cannot manage, but then they aggregate in bigger volumes, they sell to us, and then for us we identify the international market. So my talk today was basically about building trust from the source through the value chain and going until the end. And most importantly, us as Export Development Fund, we are building the trust further by also identifying international market that they should buy from these women. And the best with Export Development Fund is that, or us participating partly as government, is that we are practicing responsible sourcing. We have our story narrated everywhere, well written, and we are able to to give a picture or to describe where we are sourcing our stones from. So another key important thing that we have seen in the value chain of artisan small-scale mining is that traceability. It's quite key. Traceability of every mineral that you are selling, that you're accessing and selling, and therefore taking it to the international market. Our hope is that moving forward, you see Malawi benefiting from its natural resources, benefiting from its minerals. We feel like it's quite unfair that we should be lacking forex when we have a lot of high value products such as the gemstones and gold. So thank you, Sarah. That's what I really wanted to share today about building trust from the source until the end.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Elvine. That is just, as always, truly brilliant. So round of applause, everybody, for all the way from Malawi, the wonderful Elvine. Fantastic. I mean, I'm going to bring Ludovic straight into the conversation because we've been messaging quite extensively, actually, over the last few minutes. Ludovic, do you want to pose that first question that you had?
Thanks, Levine. Nice to see you again. I thought it was really interesting how you sort of went through a pricing, conflict, a bidding war almost, and saw the end goal. What I'd like to know is the EDF initiative still going strong? And are you able to achieve external pricing that incentivizes? Because if you had to go up, then is the profitability still there? Because of course, if it is, we're talking about sustainable long-term operations. If it's not, how can we prove that?
Okay. No, thank you very much, Ludovic, for that question. To be honest, the price competition is not sustainable, and it's something that that is hitting us hard. So as of now, we are buying gold at a loss. I have to be honest, we are buying gold at a loss, but our only benefit is that we're able to convert our Malawian kwacha into US dollars or into foreign currency. So our participation in the gold trading is mainly to convert our kwacha value into foreign currency. You may be asking how we are doing this. It's because we buy gold at our Malawian currency, Malawi kwacha, we're buying from the locals, and then when we are trading it on the international market, that's when we get the equivalent US dollars. So sometimes it tends to be cheaper than borrowing the same dollar from another bank international. So for gold, we are not really operating at a profit, but also, as I said, that we started in 2021 where our volumes were quite low, and then they started picking up. After the price competition, we now we stopped at a certain stage, and because we had built trust from the local communities and from some of the middlemen, because of that trust, then they keep on selling their gold to us, and we have brought in a stiff competition to the smugglers or to those that illegally exporting gold. So that's one thing. And on the other hand, we're also implementing a gemstones project where we are buying high value gemstones and low value gemstones. As much as there's competition in the gemstone sector, but gemstones is it's the one that is that deems to be profitable because we're able to source it from the locals at a lower price and then sell it in international market at a fair price. And this is now helping us in two ways. One, to generate forex for the country, and on the other hand, have a small profit. And this profit, because we are buying using taxpayers' money on behalf of the government, then we are also bringing profits to the citizens of Malawi. So that's how we most less like the cost benefit analysis. We are able to maximize our profits from the gemstone sector, unlike the gold, which is mostly with international price that are fixed and can't be negotiated.
Thanks very much. I think what's really interesting there is that, as we were discussing a couple of weeks ago, whatever happens to gold today is the basis that we can take forward to address informal mining in CRMs, which is actually increasing globally. So I like how you're sort of taking a very holistic approach to the profitability and sustainability of this operation. Last question, if I still have time. Are you seeing opportunities for wider collaboration on a regional level, or maybe even not geographically regional, but other African countries that have similar productions or similar stakes, where you could perhaps even group some of those value chains to have more leverage on these markets?
Yes, actually, that's the direction that we're heading towards. That's really what we want, is to have a regional visibility, and also even to explore, because we're trying to explore international market, and collaboration with the neighboring countries and also even regionally would help us the most. Probably just to give an example, there are some gemstones that are quite famous in Malawi, others are in Zimbabwe and Zambia. So now more or less like having women in mining network in the three regions, and then we pull the gemstones together and then we export them, for example, or we collaborate with a country like Ghana, which produces a lot of gold, and they also have rings. You know how rings, they want to be mounted with gemstones. So that collaboration with Ghana would also help us now to go international and then have global market. And another idea that we had was, because Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and other countries, they also have the volume stones like the rose quartz. Apparently, all these countries, they are exporting to China. They are exporting to Germany. Why? Because technology is in Germany, is in China to process these gemstones. What if we collaborate with the companies that are in China, that are in Germany, that they set up a similar factory in Africa within the region, that now we are able to ship the gemstones just nearby, and then the value is being added in country. There's capacity transfer from those companies in the there's that capacity transfer, and then we export an end product into the global market, because now you can export anywhere. So instead of exporting jobs, Forex, instead of exporting jobs like the way I said last time, now let's bring the jobs closer, let them stay in country, and then we export the end product. And if you also see, most of these countries, they are also in the construction phase, and even in the battery technology, which was just being mentioned, we will find a lot of these minerals within the region. So how do we collaborate with the companies that are manufacturing or that are processing, that they come closer to the source, and we cut on the transportation, the skills transfer, and there's also maximization of production. So that's my interest, and looking forward to collaborate with any company or people that are interested in such.
That's absolutely fantastic there, Elvine. And I think with that, it's really interesting, almost. So whilst gemstones, etc., are very different from the materials that are needed within batteries, but it's similar to what Olivia was saying earlier in terms of what can be moved in terms of where those tasks are undertaken. And I love the collaboration between those different women in mining across different parts of Africa. I'm on the board of Women in Mining UK, and women in mining in the UK is so different compared to mining in Malawi. It's really exciting.
Thank you.
Ludivine, did you have one more question that you wanted to pose?
Am I allowed? Thank you.
Yes,
so much.
Of course you are. Yeah.
I think one of the things that we're hearing is some states taking initiatives to build alternative value chains to basically compete with informal and illegal, and frankly, sometimes organized crime-driven production. The problem is that those initiatives are not always well accepted, because they're not negotiated and built with civil society or with the stakeholders. So I'm thinking in particular of some examples around gold between DRC and the UAE today. How did you get around that? Was there a specific sort of consultation process, or did you use that time of the pricing war to also get acceptance for the concept?
Okay, it's quite interesting because I've been almost everywhere. The discussions around gold in Malawi started around in 2015 when there was a gold rush. And that time I was civil society working for Oxfam, and I was amongst the people that were pushing government that they need to play an active role in this. So the government decided in 2021 that they will start buying gold. But of course, it was more or less like one way that the president has said that the Reserve Bank start buying gold. And there was indeed quite a lot of resistance from the civil society. And that time I was also part of the civil society. Then eventually I changed hats, and then I joined the initiative. So because of my background of civil society, we have tried to involve, or I am actually passionate about multi-stakeholder approach. So in our discussions, it's always the government there through the Ministry of Mining, Export Development Fund, the civil society networking, because that's my previous life and I can't completely forget, and all that. So we are indeed patronizing on multi-stakeholder approach. And my advice to other countries in such initiatives, it's always very important to engage different stakeholders, in particular the civil society, if you want to fight illegal mining, illegal trading, because they are the ones that are mostly closer to the communities. And in the community, that's when you are able to identify that this is a foreigner, this is a Malawian, this is operating with a license, this one doesn't have a license. So if you leave out such kind of people, or like such kind of groups, the civil society, then you've missed it. As government, let's always work closer to the civil society, and also even to the miners themselves, because there are others that are doing illegal mining, not that they want to, but it's because they don't have full information, or they don't know the right channels to get the information. I know my time is almost up. Yeah, that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Elavine. And thank you, Ludovine, for fielding the questions there as well. So brilliant. Elavine, massive round of applause. Thank you as always.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So we're going from Malawi, we're going to come back to the UK. And Jeff, you almost look like you're sitting in the basement of the Geological Society there.
I am sitting in the basement of the Geological Society, and what a fine place to be based.
Excellent. So everybody, we're now joined by the fantastic Jeff Townsend. Now I'm going to pass straight across to yourself, Jeff. Do you want to tell everybody who you are and why you actually care about raw materials, and then maybe segue into the whole question of trust?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm not sure about fantastic, but that's very kind of you to say. So I'm Jeff. I'm the founder of the Critical Minerals Association. It's great to see Namali with us, who founded CMA Australia. So the Critical Minerals Association brings together the industry, the upstream and midstream in that space. We founded in the UK in 2020. Australia was 2022, and the USA was 3 months ago. And we are soon to be launching our international body that will bring all our domestic associations together to deal with the big global issues that dominate the field.
And with regards to that, Jeff, so you saw the needs and you got everything going. I'm assuming there's an awful lot of pull for what you guys, or the discussions that you guys are instigating at the moment.
Yeah, so I was born on a mine. I grew up on mining communities around the world, in South Africa, Australia, Canada. Wherever my dad is a mineral processor that's where I was. But I decided that I would find a dirtier job, and I went into politics and did that for 20 years. So my background is politics, and of course, the only currency in politics is trust. In 2017, the UK government released an industrial strategy, and it didn't talk about, it spoke about building electric vehicles, renewable energy, satellites, defense, all those great things we need to move forwards and electrify the society so we can meet net zero. It did not talk about supply chains. And when I spoke to the government, they said, well, we'll just buy it from the international community. And I said, okay, that's going to be a little bit harder than you think it is. And it wasn't until we started putting the industry together and giving it a formalized, coherent, joined up voice that we started to get traction within the government. So we started in 2020 with the government not seeing a concern, and now they've done 2 critical mineral strategies, have a minister, have 20 plus civil servants across different departments. So there is progress, and I put some of that, or a lot of that, down to trust, and they trust us to be giving them the right information and ensuring that when we do talk to them, we're doing it for a reason. And I think that's really key to why we have been successful. And it's the key to why Namali is successful in Australia. I don't know if Namali told you, but she's a former trade diplomat, so she knows everyone in Australia, and equally Will, who's the CEO of CMA USA, is a former lawyer with the government, with the US government. So they know all the people, they're trusted individuals, and it helps bridge that gap, which needs to be bridged incredibly quickly.
So with that, Jeff, then in terms of that, so what you've managed to do is the different parts of government trust you. So they trust yourself and what the Critical Minerals Association is doing at the moment. Is that because they know you personally, or is it because you understand the systems, the language, the terminology of government, so you know how and who and where and when to go and ask people for things?
It's a really good question, and I'm afraid it's not a simple answer. So if I sound like I'm rabbiting on, I'm not, but I'm trying to explain something very complex. So trust is earned, and it's earned over a long time as you start to have confidence in the individual or the organization or whatever it may be, in that they are delivering you the right stuff. And that comes from knowledge. So if you know that someone is trustworthy, then you can trust them. We don't have time to build that trust. We needed to make changes to government thinking straight off the bat. So it helps to have someone like me who spent far too long walking around the corridors of power. I'm not sure they are the corridors of power, but anyway, so I knew how to operate within the system. I spoke the language that all the politicians did in the UK, but I've also worked across the EU, Africa, Middle East, USA, Canada. So I've done the rounds a bit. So I knew how to speak, and I knew how to use the right discourse and language. So it wasn't coming from an outsider, it was coming from an insider. I think that's really important. I think the final thing is, the CMA is industry-led, and it's taking that great bank of knowledge that the industry has and changing it into language that can be trusted because it's a known source. So I always give this story, but I think it's key. So when I first started this, I took a government official to a conference in the UK where two academics spoke about the molecular structure of graphite and the importance of that in terms of how quickly you can charge a battery or how far a battery can go. And it was an hour and a half of a very, very good academic debate. The government official left after 10 minutes. That's not what they wanted to hear. They just wanted to know where you're going to get it from, how you're going to get it done. So whilst that was vitally important, and more so important than what the government official wanted to know, the government official is the person with the power to change at a national level strategy or agenda. And therefore you need to take that key issue, that knowledge, and turn it into language that they understood and apply it to their concerns. I think finally, the last thing is, the UK government, when it had a question about mining, would go to Rio Tinto or Anglo American. And it would go to those because they're a FTSE 20 company. So they're huge, they're weighty, they're a known entity, and therefore the government could trust them. But of course, in 2020, Rio Tinto and Anglo American weren't really in the critical mineral space. So when the government said, is there a problem with critical minerals? The majors would say, no, there's no problem at all. And of course, if you're a 2-3 man exploration firm in the UK or Africa or Canada or Australia, there were a lot of issues to deal with.
And so with that then, Jeff, so I think just to summarize some of that, so trust is earned, and also within politics, what I thought you said, so it was really interesting. So the only currency in politics is trust. So there's a massive aspect here with regards to the value of trust. You've got to earn it, but also as well, maybe then build that foundation of trust. And then you can actually get, say, those politicians or whoever in the room to listen to the experts talking about the molecular distance, et cetera, within graphite. So is there something here where if you've built that kind of foundation of trust, then you can then layer on some of the awareness? But that awareness needs to be tailored. So it's answering the so what questions that those people who ordinarily wouldn't ever be in that room have actually got. So is there something there around you building the foundation of trust with one group, but there's also that foundation of trust with, say, the academics to say, we know that you're hugely intelligent and clever, but actually what you need to say in the first 10 minutes is answer the so what for this person who I worked really hard to get in the room. So is there something here in terms of being able to pull these different groups together?
There is. And I think this is where there is a slight problem still within the industry, is there is a lack of trust across multiple different stakeholders. So only yesterday, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but Global Witness called out Glencore and I can't remember who else because of their involvement in the battery passport, and saying you can't trust it because the mining industry has been involved. It would be far better if we were all able to sit around a table together and hammer this out and have a conversation and see we're all on the same page. Why are we all in critical minerals? The majority of us are in critical minerals because we want to create the building blocks necessary to build the net zero, the green future, right? And without the critical minerals, there is none. So But it's very hard to have a consistent conversation and message flowing from the upstream all the way through the downstream into the circular economy and then into society and the political sphere if that trust breaks down throughout the throughout the supply chain. So part of what the CMA does is to try and bring those players together and have a conversation. So actually it was Hayden Mort who introduced us, but we had a very good conversation with Extinction Rebellion. So we had the CMA representing mining and midstream players talking to Extinction Rebellion, who were, pro environment, anti-industry, and we actually had a really good conversation. And there was agreements on not all of it, but at least half of what was said. And why was that? It's because Hayden Mort could act as a mediator and a trusted body from both sides.
So to build then on what Paul Eakins shared with us at the beginning of today's session, it was that ability to find that shared interest or that, that shared value between those different parties. But to get to it, you almost needed somebody who had enough knowledge or empathy with regards to those different players to build that bridge. Is that a correct interpretation?
I think it is. And I think it's because if you look at industry and you look at stakeholders, everyone has their own agenda. Everyone has got their own ambitions and well, even within institutions, there's people who think things should be done differently and set ways. But you do need to take a step back. And perhaps that's where, whilst I've grown up surrounded by miners and, learned to swear in most of the languages where I've been based, thanks to my dad, and can talk to the mining sector, I'm not from the industry directly, from a political background. So I can see where it all fits together. I can do the math, and I don't have to, I can look past the ambitions of the individual. So, an exploration firm, what do they want? They want to get their mining permits done. They want to get planning permission. They want to get finance. They want to get through all the legal red tape. That's their focus. That's what they want to get. And they can't understand why a politician doesn't want to change something to make that easier. Finance are saying, well, yeah, we want to get money. We want to get, 8%, 10% over a 10-year return. So why are you talking about investing in the EU or the UK when you could go invest in the US and get 20% of your OPEX sorted? So everyone's got different agendas. Until you take a step back and you see, well, actually, if we all fit in and where we fit in, then it becomes a lot easier. And it takes a trusted organization. It's not an individual. It takes trusted organizations and trusted organizations across the entirety of that huge ecosphere. Or ecosystem that we need to bring together and work collaboratively to do.
And so with that, Jeff, and interesting that you say that, because when a mining company is like, going, come on, government, why aren't you helping me? And I guess that's almost in response to most politicians will say, I will do everything that I can within my power to make sure that, yes, you are successful, which seems to be, or a variation of that seems to be fairly standard within any speech that's given. But then what are they really saying? And this afternoon, actually, we've got a session on reflective listening. So actually, what is somebody really saying to you rather than just the initial level of listening? And I mean, with that, Jeff, actually, I will put you on the spot. When a politician says, I will do everything possible within my power, within whatever things I've got to play with to help you, what are they really saying, Jeff? How should we interpret that?
Every politician is different. I once had a politician say to someone that they would endeavor to try and help. Which I thought was, the company went away saying, this is brilliant, they're going to help. I was like, well, no, they're going to try and help you, but then they're not saying they're going to. So, you have to understand what the language actually means. Why is the politician wanted to help you? That's the question. So are they your local politician? And if so, are they doing it because they can see the jobs, they can see the tax, they can see the benefits to their society, their community? In which case they're more likely to help, but equally they're probably in less of a position to help. They have less levers to pull. Is it because there's a junior minister who wants to get further up the chain of command, and they can see a benefit to this and they want to stick their name to it because it's a young, new topic that people need to get a grasp of? They're very useful, but again, they get slightly mistrusted in political circles because everyone can see why they are acting the way that they are. Or is it a big minister or Secretary of State, and they've suddenly realized they will do what they can do? Absolutely. But ultimately, it all comes down to the Treasury and where the money is. And until you've won that battle, you've rarely won any at all. And the Treasury really care about the financing of everything, don't they? What they're going to get out of it, and what the cost is for cost for benefits. So they don't necessarily care about ROI, but they do care about jobs created, about investment into the local communities, etc. So that has to be taken into account, and that's in the UK it's called the Green Book. So go and look up the Green Book, and you can basically see the maths that they do to figure out how to sell your project to the Treasury.
So I guess what this is saying, okay, so what is the needs analysis, the business case, the value proposition, whichever other bingo words I can tick with regards to the world of consultancy, but for be it the Treasury or whoever it is that you're trying to engage with, say, okay, this might be a sensible way forward. Is that kind of what you're trying to create here, Jeff, or what you suggest was created?
Well, every politician is different. And you have to understand what drives the politicians, what their agenda is, so that you can tailor your sales pitch. That's undermining of what people are trying to do, but you know what I mean, to those different political factions, individuals, wherever it may be. And so if you go with the bog standard, this is what we do. It builds no trust. It's not you've taken no time to understand what someone else is concerned about, right? So that it shows a lack of respect, and respect is closely aligned to trust. And therefore, if you break one, you break both. So by understanding what someone is interested in and tailoring your message, that's how you can start to build it. But don't expect one to be able to pull the lever that helps you. You've got to win all of those battles. It's not an easy fix. And then it can be international, and then from there, who knows?
Well, on that international note, of course, very shortly we're going to go across to the lovely Namely. But Jeff, I also heard the tinkling tones of the Fortnum and Mason's clock going on behind you, which suggests that it might be time up, unfortunately, with regards to your slot just now. But do you have any final words of wisdom in terms of what you think needs to change, or actually where things are still, actually working very nicely in terms of that trust and the forwards momentum in terms of critical materials?
I think tracking and traceability of supply chains is absolutely vital. So the more that, and that's for two reasons, the more that we can demonstrate good ESG compliance throughout the supply chain, the better. The more that politicians are likely to stick their head above the parapet because they can see there's nothing wrong. And also that feeds into the downstream, and the political arenas generally around the world like talking about the downstream because they're consumer brands and it's what people understand. And the more of those consumer brands trust and understand their supply chains, the more they are likely to go and help pull or push politicians and political systems in the direction we need to go. So it's the big battle over the next 20 years that we need to do to build that trust.
Brilliant. So with that, thank you so much, Jeff, for coming and joining us here today. Everyone, please put your hands together for the fabulous Jeff Townsend. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jeff. So we're going to go from that wonderful world of politics. I was going to say murky, but that would have been very derogatory of me. So we're going to go from the fantastic world of politics across into the legal profession. And our next speaker is Quinton Newcomb. So Quinton, if you're there he is. Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you for joining us, Quintin. Everyone, if you please, put your hands together for Quintin. Fabulous. So Quintin, I'm just going to invite you to tell us, well, who are you? And so therefore, what maybe qualifies you slightly to talk a little bit about trust. And I should say as well, before we get into that, is that Quintin and I have known one another for a number of years, because a long time ago, I think it was certainly the first mine that I ever went into. We went into an artisanal mine in Bolivia. So it was a silver mine, and that certainly influenced my career. I don't know, Quintin, in terms of you introducing yourself, if going down that mine has influenced you at all. But Quintin, over to yourself.
Yeah, I think, Sarah, I'm sorry to say, because it dates us, that was 20 years ago. So, and it seems like a distant memory, but a very vivid one still. And I think certainly the only time in my life that I'll ever buy dynamite from a corner shop, still less give dynamite as a gift, which is exactly what we did, of course, for the miners on that occasion. So just very briefly, in terms of who I am, I'm a partner at the international law firm Field Fisher. And I started life as a criminal barrister, and I still work broadly in the area of crime, but it's commercial crime, principally defending companies who are under suspicion of bribery and corruption or serious fraud offences in the context of investigations. But the other aspect of my work is working with companies to improve their compliance and governance processes and procedures. And obviously a core part of that will be around matters such as anti-bribery and corruption, anti-money laundering and fraud, and those sorts of things. And of course, where there are issues, we also commonly conduct investigations for companies to understand what's gone wrong. Mining is one of those sectors which, as you all know, is high risk. And so by no coincidence, I have had over the years a number of mining sector clients. And I suppose that's where I've interacted with mining since those heady days of 20 years ago and Potosi. And in terms of how that's influenced me, so a confession, I don't think I've really thought about that until you raised it in the context of this panel session. But I think it has influenced me because Potosi, which many of you will be familiar with, no doubt, in Bolivia, was a mine which was really exploited for the first time in a serious way after, I think, a few attempts in the 13th century. By the conquistadors and the Spanish in the 16th century. And Potosi became, I think, the richest, or certainly one of the richest cities in the world as a result of that exploitation. And it was, frankly, and with apologies to any Spanish on the call, but I think it's long enough ago that I can get away with saying it was exploitation in that sense. And it obviously it was of its time. And so we were told as we went around the mine that in the 3 centuries over which it had been mined by the Spanish, I think the figure was extraordinarily 8 million people had lost their lives in the mine, both local population and slaves who had been brought in by the Spanish to work the mines. And over the same period, I think the figure was 62,000 metric tons of silver had been built, and the story was that it was enough to build a bridge all the way from Potosi to Madrid. And so I suppose having learned about that and seen the exploitation, and I suppose the physical remnants, because you still had the remnants of wealth, you still had the beautiful colonial houses and squares and the great churches and statues, but of course they'd all been fallen into disrepair because the population had been left in a financially, ruinous state. And so there wasn't money even to provide the most basic of maintenance to these beautiful remnants of the colonial era. And I think seeing, if you like, what I would describe as the long-standing physical scars or effects of exploitation, because Potosi is now an incredibly poor town, and that was evident everywhere we looked. And there are still thousands of miners going down the mine, literally to make their daily bread every single day the best they can. And so that is respectfully an example. You've talked a lot about the need, with which I agree, of engaging with local communities. That's probably at the far end of where that happened to the local community. They had no choice in the matter. Essentially, there was no consultation, there was no forethought about the impact on them, perhaps. And so that's one end of the spectrum. And I think mining's history helps us there. And I think a lot of the topics we talked about can assist in understanding why it's so necessary to ensure there's that engagement and that forethought of the impact of what we're doing as a sector today, because we can't be complacent about how far we've come, which of course is an extraordinarily long way, but we still have a journey to travel. So that's a very long, forgive me, answer to your question, but I think having seen the impact of that and the impact of corruption fundamentally on a local population, it did actually, with hindsight, give me that reference point that when I had the opportunity to start to work in financial crime and corruption and start to assist companies, I guess I did have that kind of vivid memory and motivation and interest, really, which probably does stem back to that moment when we were deep underground in the mine.
Thanks for that, Quintin. And I'm seriously impressed by your ability to retain those facts and figures with regards to Potosi itself. And actually, so I've got my diary from back then here, and I've written down that apparently inscribed on the wall of a pub in Potosi, somebody had written, "Life should be something you create, not endure."
Yeah.
And I think, so that in a way from 20 years ago and seeing what had been created there certainly has sat with me for the last 20 years and influenced my thoughts and my feelings as well. Mm-hmm. But coming back to yourself, Quintin, in terms of the law and so as somebody who works in the legal profession, I personally, I would see a lawyer as somebody who I think, okay, I go to you and I trust what you're going to say, or you're certainly, for example, from if something goes to court, I might not like what the verdict is, as it were, but I'm going to trust it as to be the most right decision that is made in that situation. Is that a correct assumption from my behalf, or where does trust and the law come together?
I certainly hope it's right from your perspective is the answer. And actually, I was thinking about, because of the previous speaker, the contrast between lawyers and politicians, and you're probably right. I mean, I think the default for the population at large of a politician is to view them often with suspicion and cynicism, whereas I think a lawyer, you get in your first interaction a presumption at least of that kind of trust and integrity. So you're absolutely right. I think that has to be, in the lawyer's case, maintained, and of course you are judged, of course, by your conduct. And once that trust, if it's lost, is lost, then it's lost forever on an individual basis as a lawyer, or also as a firm or a team. So I think you're right, and I suppose I wear two hats, as you know, both as a lawyer and sitting as a judge. And I think certainly in my experience, the presumption is overwhelmingly proven right. And there are the exceptions to every rule, but of course there are in every walk of life. But I think overwhelmingly, I think what you've opened with is accurate and fair.
Fantastic. So with that, Quintin, so sitting as a judge, and I think, all of us certainly watch various different legal dramas and everything else. When you are there looking at a particular situation and you know that you've got to make a decision with regards to what you're looking at, what are you relying on, what are you drawing on in terms of your experience, your knowledge, your professional training to say, okay, what is right and what is wrong?
I think it's everything that goes into the mix, isn't it? So you have a really rigorous training at the beginning of your life as a lawyer, which is what I did exactly after we were together in the early noughties, and then you accumulate experience, and on that kind of very technical overlay, you get to interact with people and you see what happens in cases in real life, if you like. And as with anything, that's where the nuance comes, and you see that there are very commonly in the law, as with many things, not black and white answers. And certainly in the area in which I practice, that's very commonly the case. So yes, there are certain legal questions and certain legal disciplines where there is a definitive right answer. Of course there are. And that's probably what most people think of when it comes to the law. You're either breaking the law or you're not. But in many instances, particularly around compliance, and that's highly relevant, I think, in the mining sector, you are dealing with what I'd call risk-based problem solving. So what rules and regulations apply to us, what laws apply to us, both locally and internationally, and what's our potential exposure and why. And then with that overlay, it borders more on what you and I have discussed in the past and worked together on, which is that kind of risk appetite and tolerance, really. You know, there will be a right decision, if you like, for one company, which is the totally wrong decision for another. And that won't necessarily be that either of them is doing anything unlawful or transgressing, but they just have a different risk appetite and profile to approach the market with. And that's fine. So as long as we as the lawyers make absolutely clear what the risks are and where there's a risk, give guidance and assistance as to how that can be mitigated to the fullest possible extent. And of course, very commonly, risks simply can't be mitigated completely. Then we're doing our bit. And so we're rather than coming to the right decision, if you like, in a very academic exam question way, we're assisting our client to make the right decision for them, taking into account all of those different considerations.
So with that, Quinton, so there's I guess there's a difference in terms of who's making the decision, and so who's actually accountable at the end of the day. So as a lawyer, if we're providing guidance, we're providing assistance so that somebody can understand the uncertainties or the risks with regards to a certain course of action or a certain situation. At the end of the day, I guess, is the final decision on what somebody does actually on them rather than on you providing that legal advice. However, you're being judged on your conduct in terms of providing that guidance. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So the buck will always stop with the client, who is, whatever it may be, entering the transaction or engaging with the third party that they're dealing with. So the buck will always stop with them. But of course, if the advice given by the lawyer is incompetent or negligent, then of course there is recourse to that lawyer if things go wrong at the time. So we have as you all know, a highly regulated environment that we work in and very high professional standards to adhere to. So it's of course a question of providing practical advice, but making sure that we're giving robust advice when we need to, and even when it's not necessarily the answer the client wants to hear commercially, we have to give that advice. But for the most part, it's risk-based, practical, problem-solving advice to facilitate business rather than to try and stand in the way of what our clients are seeking to do.
And so with that client-lawyer relationship, and especially where, say, you need to give somebody advice or guidance that is not what they want to hear and actually might be totally the polar opposite to the direction that they want to travel in. Do you ever feel that sort of that trust, because that's what that relationship is based on, do you feel that stretching, or, you know, has it got the propensity to break because you're not telling them what they want to hear? Is there anything in that?
I think it depends entirely on the client and that individual relationship. I think if you win trust, then generally that gives you the right to give the difficult advice and for there to be the mutual respect and understanding that you would not be giving it unless it was really important to protecting the interests of that company. And so I think you, as I say before, you start with a default of trust. You have to continue to earn that every time you interact with your client. And as long as that's there, as and when those moments come where you're having difficult conversations, hopefully you've earned the right to have that conversation and it will be respected.
So do you feel that if you haven't yet earned that right to have the conversation or built that trust and respect between yourself and whoever the client is, can you deliver the bad news, as it were, or the stuff that they don't want to hear? Or does that become more difficult because you haven't quite got to that stage in the relationship?
I mean, unfortunately, as with all things, you can't necessarily pick the timing and when these things come up and when you need to deliver that difficult advice. And the reality is, if it's early in the relationship and you need to give them uncomfortable advice, that's what you have to do. And lawyers aren't entitled to take into account their own self-interest in giving that advice. So your interests of the client are paramount. You give the advice which is going to protect your client and look after their interests, without taking into account, they might sack me, frankly. And so you do have professionally that clarity. You have no choice but to give that advice where it's necessary.
And I guess with that, so I mean, what's the worst that could happen, provided you are giving the correct advice? Is okay, fine. They don't pay your bill, they sack you. I mean, there are other clients in the sea, as it were. In terms of the accountability, in terms of taking that advice and then making the right decision with it. So as an individual providing advice, the accountability sits with me. So it's a very personal thing. However, if you're advising somebody who works for a company, and so therefore actually the accountability might get diluted because it's a group of people rather than a single person having to make that decision. Is there a difference between people who are making decisions as a company versus as an individual? And is there any variation in that, again, from making that right decision?
I think the consequences are more perhaps acute or immediate for an individual. Of course they are. So if it's an individual who's involved in a legal matter, the emotion is different. The immediate consequences of them is different. But of course, when you're dealing with a collective, if you're providing advice to a general counsel or a board, they are the company. They represent the company, and the company is a person. And so they are the ones who are having to take responsibility and exercise their obligations in the interest of the entire company, which may, of course, represent tens of thousands of employees and of course, multiple stakeholders outside of that. So again, overwhelmingly, our experience is that those individuals take that obligation extremely seriously.
And so I think that's something which is really important for everybody to realize, is that those individuals who are on the board of an organization, it's them that's on the line. It's not this kind of weird thing that is a company or as a business. And because otherwise the accountability is very difficult to anchor to a person. And so therefore holding someone to account, and going back to those days, sort of seeing what we saw in Potosi 20 years ago, and that exploitation, etc., and all the different dynamics with regards to that area there, by saying, oh, it was the Spanish that carried out this exploitation. Of course, it's not everybody in Spain that did it or anything, but it's interesting, isn't it, from a language perspective, where it's very common for people to say, oh, the Spanish did this, or that group did that, or this company did something, whereas actually it's individuals who are making those decisions and carrying out those actions.
Absolutely.
So just in closing, Quintin, so for the likes of Rose and myself, who are by no means experts with regards to the legal profession, etc., do you have any final hints or tips if we're looking to say, okay, how do we try and create more trust, respect, etc., within the raw materials value chain? Is there anything that we can learn from the legal profession that could be pulled across and say, right, these are some of the core principles which are really important?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things you're always going to want to do as a lawyer, when you've got a client, is understand what their needs and wants are. What are they trying to get out of the situation? What's important to them? What are their concerns? And really understanding that. And then very quickly you turn to, and it depends, of course, on the nature of the matter, but it might be their opponent in litigation, or it might be a counterparty in a transaction. And you try and understand exactly the same from their perspective as well. What's their priority here? What's their concern? What are they likely to feel less strongly about? What's more likely to be a red line and is going to be at the absolute core of what they want to achieve from the relationship or the litigation or whatever it might be. And I think, of course, that is going to help, taking that time to fully understand the position of all stakeholders and how they are going to feel, and what the impact of a transaction or litigation might be is key. So I think that's an obvious transferable. I think also there's been conversation, I know, over the past couple of days around the transparency that there increasingly is. And so companies should want to take time to understand the strengths and weaknesses of their position commercially, of course, and the position of other parties. But if it is purely focusing on what's advantageous to me commercially, then the whole world is watching in a way that it hasn't been watching ever before in terms of the various transparency initiatives. And I know you've spoken around that, and people get to see what the commercial deal is, and they get to see what the impact on the community is. And there's never been more communication around that. So even if you don't instinctively want to do it for the right reasons, do it because it's never been more transparent, and you're never going to be held to account more than you will be today. And I think, you know, that has to be welcome. And so all of these transparency initiatives and obligations, we've got things like the passporting obligations coming up in due course. All of that has to be welcomed because it's driving good behaviors. And hopefully we can all agree that wanting to do it and doing it early and embracing it now is preferable for everyone concerned. But great, if not, that we will drag those who are falling behind through more of those sorts of initiatives.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Quintin, for coming and enlightening us with regards to everything that you've just shared, and also those hints and tips. And there's a huge amount of overlap, isn't there, everyone, with regards to actually having the ability to see the world or a particular problem or a decision from different perspectives is so important, because if you're only looking at it from your perspective, then you're actually going to annoy somebody else, or you're probably going to miss something at some point. So, Quintin, thank you so much. Quintin Newcombe, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Bye-bye.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Q. Our final speaker that we have for us this morning in this first session on Wednesday, the 10th of May, is the fabulous Namali, who is dialing into us from Australia. Namali, thank you so much for having been here through the entirety of the session. I think it's going to be great to hear your thoughts and your feelings with regards to what we've heard today. But do you want to introduce yourself to everybody who is on the session, and then we can get cracking with some questions. So Namali, over to yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. So I'm Namali McKay. I'm the Managing Director of the Critical Minerals Association Australia, which Jeff Townsend, who you've just heard from, founded both in the UK and here in Australia. And we have been up and running in Australia for just only about 6 months now. But what's really interesting about your topic, Sarah, about the criticality of trust, is that we've entered the market here in Australia, or started up, I would say, as some kind of industry disruptor. So, you know, Australia has a very strong mining history, as you all know. And we've come in as a Critical Minerals Association, and there wasn't one, which is quite surprising already in Australia. And what we found is that actually all of these critical minerals companies were interspersed with coal and gold and, you know, associations that represented the whole of mining. So we've come in and sort of disrupted that model and said, here we are, we're in a group of companies that we're pulling together, all about critical minerals. We're powering the new sort of energy revolution. We're not fossil fuel based. You know, we have ethical and responsible practices, and that's really kind of brought up a bit of angst, I would say, in the sort of mining industry, because, you know, what's happened is it's had a lot of companies question, okay, well, where do we sit on this spectrum? What's our track record? And we're being fussy about who we take on as a result, because it's not a country, I guess, like the UK, where there's not a lot of mining in comparison to Australia. So, you know, we just have the entire spectrum. And so our whole mission is entirely based on being able to build trust and credibility, and really to kind of reposition the industry and the country. And it's been fascinating listening to everybody else, because I mean, I guess what's interesting is that Australia's in this very unique position at the moment, where we just have a huge amount of critical minerals at our disposal in terms of supply, but it's all in the ground. And to get it out, as we know, is a massive challenge in the time frame. So we have this huge demand at your end of the world, you know, banging on the door, and then we just simply can't get it out in time and get it out responsibly. And so we're facing a huge number of, I would say, trust issues, and they you know, they range from things like well, ESG is a big one, and greenwashing, greenwashing is fundamentally an undermining of trust, is it not? And so we're looking at companies sometimes, want to join the association to give it themselves a green tick because we do value ESG so highly. And, we have a lot of challenge around, well, what are you actually doing? And, you and I will be talking tomorrow on our webinar about ESG and, about Australia, are we a trustworthy, environmentally sustainable and social? Do we adhere in the way that we say? But, I could keep going on, but I'll just stop there as an intro.
No, I think that's fascinating. So, Namali, where you were maybe beginning to tiptoe into, is Australia trustworthy? Is that what you were going for, or is the CMA Australia trustworthy?
Well, that's a really good question. I think I would answer yes to both of those in different spheres. I think we are having, as CMA Australia, we have to demonstrate our own credibility in this space. And there's, when you hold up such high, big values as your core principle, there's a massive sort of onus on you to uphold that and not undermine trust as you're going along. So, it's the responsibility is on us to vet who we take in, what we say. There's a big trust, I guess, responsibility of trust on us, but also your point about Australia, that is a whole separate issue. Because Australia is not, we don't have child labour. We have a very good governance structure. You could easily assume, I guess, that we are a very responsible, we tick all of the ESG boxes. But, you've also seen, Rio Tinto blowing up the occasional cave, and we have very, very big, deeply entrenched Indigenous First Nations people issues where a lot of the mining of critical minerals and other minerals happens on Indigenous ground. We have some major, major challenges. And they're all fundamentally, I would say, sort of trust-based.
And with that, Namali, because again, in terms of almost like the brand or the persona of Australia out to the world, it is quite different, I think, having spent lots of time working and living in Australia itself. And just to dive into those areas of trust, especially with regards to, I guess, changing relationships and respect, perhaps, with regards to Indigenous peoples. Do you want to describe a bit more with regards to what's been, I guess, changing in Australia, even over just the last few years?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is really interesting because I've been away from Australia for a long time and only just returned. I've been in the UK for my sins, and I'm back. And, just something as simple as acknowledging the country, that has now become a very common practice I would only say in the last 5 years or so, that we acknowledge the Aboriginal ground on which we stand before we speak or have a meeting or a gathering, and it's become woven into the culture. I mean, that's just a very peripheral example, but we have Indigenous partner organisation that we consult with, and one of the things that they are trying to do is, rather than having Indigenous buy-in into mining operations by having them, tick various boxes, that their whole concept is about, why don't you give us some ownership of this operation? Whether it's not just about just having a few Indigenous people employed or giving them a vehicle or whatever handout there is. It's about creating some kind of ownership in the project that belongs to the Indigenous people as well. I mean, that's just one example. And that conversation would never have happened a long time ago, or even recently. So it is definitely changing. And I think also at your end of the world, consumers are demanding that. And that has flowed, it's flowed through the supply chain, and that's forced some of this conversation and some of this change, which is great. It's a good thing. Yeah.
And I guess with that, also building on some of the earlier conversations we had today, is maybe the consumer end or the end user part of the world. When I was thinking about Olivia's fantastic map that she had, is saying, hey, we want all these credentials, but we're not necessarily willing to pay for it. Are you seeing any of that differentiation in the market that Paul was referring to earlier, where if you can prove that you've managed to find and extract and process this material in a responsible manner, is there a premium with regards to that, or is that not quite there yet?
So this is crucial. It's not quite there yet. And I think that is the challenge that we face here in having suppliers and extractors and operators at the upstream end actually buy into being responsible, because at the end of the day, price and money dictates everything. And so they're not seeing that coming down the chain yet. And so I think it's at this stage, it's very much an investment in the future, in an investment in knowing that premium will come. But also there's a whole group of miners who don't believe that premium is there. So there's all of that sort of diverse set of views as well to contend with.
And so with this, I don't know, maybe I can bring Jeff into the conversation, because Jeff, having established the Critical Minerals Association, firstly here in the UK, but then also maybe looking at the differentiation between what does it look like from a UK context compared to an Australian context, and what Namali's just been describing now, obviously, is the Australian context. And so there's slightly different needs, demands, mechanisms through which to create that trust. Jeff, do you have any comments on that?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we set up the associations as different entities. So CMA Australia is there to promote Australian companies and the country, because it's a different place to the UK. So technically, CMA UK and CMA Australia are in competition with each other, but we're friends, so it's all good. Look, it's not. There's no horses for courses. It's slightly different everywhere you go, and there are different, even to the extent of issues. The way that issues play out can be completely different, even within a single country, let alone between countries. So, Cornwall generally pro mining, Buckinghamshire, where there is nothing to mine apart from clag and mud, very anti-mining. But Australia has a history of mining, and even the average man down the pub can tell you about mining. Yeah, it's an interesting one, and the way that you engage and the way that you have to operate is different, and that's why we were very lucky when Namali said to me that she was going back to Australia. I said, "Well, if you don't have a job, I've got a challenge for you," and thankfully she took it on, because I don't know anyone else could do such a good job.
Thank you very much for that, Jeff. So Namali, coming back to yourself, Jeff mentioned something interesting there, where from a UK perspective, and again, this can be backed up, but again, there are assumptions in here. If it's a part of the country where there is a history of mining and there is mining, people are generally going, okay, yeah, we understand it. Perhaps we're a bit more pro. Whereas if you go to other parts of the country where there is no mining, then you get more of an anti-mining vibe. I think, Jeff, that's what you were putting on the table there. From an Australian perspective, Namali, where, let's face it, there is a lot more mining, but of course the land mass is much bigger than what we have in the UK. Do you see that? And from a kind of, do people like mining or don't like mining, or holding mining to account? What does that look like in Australia?
Well, I think that's changing, because compared to the UK, for example, the culture of mining is very much embedded, in the economy, in the, in the sort of fabric of society here. but generationally, that's really shifting. And I think, your millennials and others who are now the consumers are not willing to, they just have a different set of values that don't fit with traditional mining. And that's very much what we're seeing the world over, but the same here, I would say. And we've got a whole set of unique issues as well, in terms of we are located in Asia, and our biggest trading partner is also the biggest consumer of our critical minerals, that being China. And I think we had, I don't know what the right set of words are, but a real had to have a really good look in the mirror during the time when China imposed trade sanctions on Australia, and our whole way of operating has had to be restructured, I guess. And this is all, again, another function of trust, and lack of trust. And there's a whole raft of issues around how do we manage that relationship? How do we manage our critical mineral supply chain through the majority of Australian critical minerals companies trade with China. That's their next port of call, and that's very understandable. So there's a lot of dynamic of change going on there.
So with that, Namali, do you see that in terms of, say, the US saying, okay, we need to make sure that we've got security of supply that doesn't rely on that supply chain going through China, similar rhetoric, for example, from Europe, etc. Are you seeing that impact on Australia with regards to the relationship between Australia and China, and then also perhaps the opportunity with regards to Australia and some of those other nations? Is that something where we're seeing some kind of really big tensions or stresses being put on the supply chains at the moment, both from a threat but also an opportunity perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that supply chain tension and actual practical problems that we faced a couple of years ago has really brought home the fact that we need to have a conversation about not putting all our eggs in one basket, which is kind of what the CMA is about. And I'll let Jeff come in a minute. But what's interesting is, while we're having that conversation up here about it, in practice, a lot of critical minerals companies have no choice but to trade with China. So there's this disconnect, there's a tension. And as I was saying earlier on, Australia's now pushing to develop its midstream so that we are less reliant on other countries in that sort of way. But the timing of this, it just is not likely to work, in terms of the demand. And so how do we handle that? And, I'll hand over to you, Jeff, because I know you will have something to say here.
Cheers, Namali. It's interesting, isn't it? Because you just look at the international collaboration or engagement. So the UK wants to build its midstream as well. And so it goes to Australia and it says, right, we'd like your minerals, please. We'd like to have a relationship with you. And the Aussie government doesn't necessarily trust the UK government A, to deliver that, but B, to also not try and push a dig and ship approach. So Australia wants to build a midstream. The UK wants to build a midstream. So you're both going after the same thing. In reality, you need each other, but there's a lack of trust because both are so desperate to develop their own and capture that economic benefit as well. I feel sorry for Australia, who, you just look at what happened with Bali a year ago. Was it a year ago? 18 months ago. You're trying to create an alternative supply chain, but at the same time you can get punished relatively easy, which doesn't make it a beneficial position to be in. Although having an Australian godfather, they can be quite stubborn Aussies. So I think they'll be fine.
There we go. Lovely. You're going to be fine because Jeff said that that's the case.
Yeah. Oh, that's lucky, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, you know, you made the point, Sarah, about the US, and yeah, I mean, this is what Jeff, step in when you want to, but this is what we're doing in the critical minerals associations of the US and the UK and Australia and Canada as well, just trying to have that conversation between like-minded countries, which I guess mirrors, you know, the sentiment that the MSP has started to discuss. Yeah.
I mean, we would love the critical minerals associations to join together through our new body, CMIA, Critical Minerals International Alliance. Lots of different acronyms. But why is that important? Because at the moment, you've got one side of the coin, which is a government and political team of nations, like-minded nations, but they don't have an industrial counterpart to that. So what we're trying to build is an industrial counterpart to that, so where you can get industry to say, okay, these are the issues, this is actually what needs to happen at a global level. We'll let the domestic associations scrap it out between themselves. It's the right thing to do, but there are certain global issues that need to be dealt with, whether that's on things from ESG, vitally important, through to how do you transport waste to build a circular economy, through to simple things like let's not let geopolitics get in the way of meeting net zero agendas.
So with that, what I'm going to do is first say thank you so much, Namely, for joining us all the way from Australia and really giving us that Australian insight with regards to some of these aspects of the challenges that we face. So Namely, thank you so much. Round of applause for the wonderful Namely. But I'm going to keep you guys here because we're going to go straight into a final panel session. So I know that Elavine is still with us, and I know that Olivia has been listening in on her phone and is now back in her full glory. But maybe, Olivia, if I can bring you into this conversation that we're having now, because I think it's fascinating in terms of what do the different players in this game actually want to get from it. And of course, if you look at, say, Australia, so a producer of a lot of these materials in terms of the raw materials, and the UK user of a lot of these materials, with going back to that diagram you had, there are some of those activities that can either go upstream or downstream. Olivia, from your perspective in that battery space, when people are having these discussions around who actually does the beneficiation, who's winning? Is it a case where actually that beneficiation should go towards the people who are producing those raw materials, such as Australia, or should the beneficiation go downstream towards the people who are building the cars or whatever the case might be, such as the UK? What's your perspective, Olivia? And then I'm really keen to hear Elavine's perspective on this as well.
So I think it can be a win-win here, because say if we did open up more facilities to refine the materials in Australia, then that is opening up a whole new market and many more jobs. They have a lot of the raw materials there. Say for instance, lithium, 60% was coming from Australia, but they're not processing them in Australia. So if they started doing that there, then that's opening up new jobs, new things there. And then as well, transporting them once they are into their refined state, which is a lot smaller, easier to transport, and then taking it to the end where it's ending up in the electric vehicles at the EV manufacturing facilities. That's then also a win for them, because they're just receiving them in their end state, and it's coming in a way that has been sustainably refined, processed, and that's all able to be tracked. It's not having been transported to a place where we've gone to an opaque part of the supply chain. So it's a win-win at both ends, I see, for both the miners and the end market users. But happy for that to be built on from others. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks for that, Olivia. And I'm just I know that Elevine, she's got a couple of conversations going on in the background at the moment. So just sticking with yourself, Olivia, in terms of that transparency then, because of course, at the moment, there's a very good reason why China is sitting in the middle of this value chain. And that's in part because many decades ago, they put in place their mineral strategy and they've done a very good job of executing on it. Also, as well, in terms of the innovation and the ability to process these materials or to do the different stages of beneficiation, a huge amount of work has gone into that. And of course, a lot of that IP, that intellectual property resides within China. And I think anybody else, of course, would be protective of that as well. So in terms of making us perhaps, again, people outside of China feeling more comfortable with regards to materials that flow through that jurisdiction, would that enhance transparency so people can say, look, I understand how this is being produced. And I know that production plant is adhering to environmental standards, etc., that would be the same anywhere else in the world. If that transparency was available to people, do you think that people outside of China would have more trust of what's going on inside China?
Yeah, but I think that creating the trust and transparency within inside China is going to be difficult. They've got different processes and ways of doing things that we don't fully understand. They are so developed, and we've got to take our hat off to them. They have done excellently well. They're ahead of the race for many reasons. And they've got so many people driving new innovations that we are way behind of. But to answer your question, do you mean, what do you mean in transparency? So if they're still going to China, or if we're taking out and just going straight from Australia to, say, the end markets in Europe?
If it's still going to China, because let's face it, that's where the ability to undertake an awful lot of this processing resides. So what level of transparency would we need?
Yeah, what I would more suggest is that we do a lot of the processing more local to where the mines actually are, so it doesn't have to be transported to China. That would be my biggest suggestion. Cut out that middleman, so it can go straight from, say, from mine to being refined in a location nearby, and then straight to the end market where it's put in to the electric vehicle. Because when I showed that graph, there was those two blue spots, the refined intermediaries and the active materials. They aren't dependent on a certain location at the moment. We can decide where those locations are. At the moment, they are happening in China, but they can happen elsewhere. So I'm saying potentially we should build facilities that are outside of China.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Olivia. I know that we've got Elevine back with us at the moment. So talking about where that beneficiation, Elevine, should happen, and you talked about this in your talk in terms of being able to, again, bring it further upstream. So it is the people who are actually extracting the material from the ground, that beneficiation being closer to what they're doing. And then as well, if it can't be done by one particular group of individuals, collaborating with others so that you've then got the scale to be able to create that particular infrastructure, for example, that you need. And so I'm assuming, therefore, from your perspective, we're going further upstream with regards to all of this, rather than saying, no, take all of our uncut and our rough gems. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Sarah. That's exactly what I hinted on earlier on. Let's take the technologies close to the source. We cut on other expenses and then let it go direct to the end users. Because if you look it's both artisan and small scale mining, and even large scale mining, where you have minerals exchanging a lot of hands, that's where there's a lot of potential, or there's lack of transparency, there's exploitation and all those things. So if we cut the chain, if we narrow down the chain, I think that is going to help solve a lot of problems.
Fantastic. And as well, I guess with that, if you're narrowing the chain down, then those people who are trading in an illegal manner, and so therefore buying the less processed material, actually they don't have a seat at the table, because what they would usually buy and sell to those people who's doing the beneficiation is no longer even an option, because you're doing that beneficiation in country.
Exactly. That's true.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yes.
So what we're going to do just in the last couple of minutes is work our way around the group. And Namely, I'm going to start with you because you've been listening from start to finish. in 30 seconds, are there any key takeaways from what we've heard today that you think, that is different to what I was anticipating, or yes, that totally reconfirms what I'm looking for, and excellent, I just found another person who thinks the same way as I do?
Do you know what I found fascinating is the I think it was Andy who talked about the push to decrease demand at the end use stage. I thought that was brilliant. Like, just really something to think about, especially for us at the upstream end. Like, what does that mean for us? That's huge. So really fascinating. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm still going to go away with the whole bus statistics, to be completely honest, and make sure that everyone starts talking about that at home. Brilliant. Thank you, Namali. Jeff, how about yourself? Any aha moments? And then we're going to go to Olivia.
Not so much aha moments, but more just it's so good to see that this topic is being discussed openly, and the impact and the necessity of trust throughout the supply chain, just as a core part. I think it's excellent to hear. So thanks to everyone who's taken part.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Great. Olivia, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Elavine.
Any aha moments, but also want to echo Jeff's mostly. It was really interesting to hear how these all weaved together. And I found it interesting that we were talking a lot about, we came here today to talk about trust, but then it really came down to transparency. That was a common thread and buzzword to it. So yeah, interesting. And thank you so much for the discussion today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Olivia. Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, we're all inherently nosy, aren't we? So we want to know what's really going on, and then we can make our minds up as whether we trust what's actually happening out there. But Elavine, how about yourself? And then I'll bring in Ludovine for any final words and commentary.
Okay, thank you so much. For me, I also found this discussion quite interesting, and I was actually impressed to see how trust is applied at different levels and how it is also critical in the whole value chain. And I think my aha moment was Olivia's presentation. I have never thought of battery technology along the sides that she presented today. So it has given me a different view, and I really like the presentation and also the contributions of everyone. So this was a very good discussion. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Elavine. Fantastic. And finally, Ludovine, any final commentary for us?
No, I thought it was extremely interesting to be looking at this from the perspective of such different stakeholders. I think one of the complexities right now is that we are trying to shape a lot of policy, a lot of discourse, a lot of narratives very urgently, and dealing with an industry that itself is shifting constantly. So the best thing we can do is try and weave as many of those together. I do think that some of our narratives deserve some challenging. So I look forward to continuing those discussions.
Exactly. This is all about challenge and open dialogue and welcoming those different perspectives as well. So brilliant. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us here today. Absolutely fantastic. And a round of applause to all of our fabulous speakers and panelists that we've had with us on the first session that we have here today. For me personally, I think there was a huge amount of discussion yesterday around that transparency aspect, which has flowed through into today. One of the key messages from today, I think, has been being able to see different other people's perspectives and actually recognize the fact that they might be totally different to our own, and there may be tension with regards to all of that. Now, this afternoon, we then go into a session all by itself, which is going to kick off with how do you listen to one another? So we know that everybody else will have everybody will have a different perspective to us, but how do we begin to understand what that perspective really is? We've touched on some of those items earlier on today. So we're going to start off with how to listen. And then we're going to go into the world of tailings dams, which of course is one of those areas of high risk within the mining sector, because every year it seems we have a significant failure of one of the tailings facilities. So how on earth do we begin to create trust with regards to those pieces of infrastructure? We're then going to talk more about building consensus. We're going to listen to people who are experts in negotiation. And then finally, we're going to come through into that transparency aspect. So we've got Leanne Kemp, so the founder of Everledger, so one of the main companies that provide us with a tool through which we can do it. And then finally, in the last session of today, we're going to hear from John Crawley, who is going to share insights and stories from the Northern Ireland peace process. So not really anything to do with raw materials, but a lot to do with building trust. So this afternoon's session will start at 3 o'clock UK time. So apologies for those of you in Australia, it will be the middle of the night, but it'll be fantastic for people who are in the Americas. So again, we all have to take the hits every so often. So that's this afternoon session. We will have another session tomorrow at exactly the same times as we were working to today. So starting off at 8 a.m. UK time, finishing off at 11 a.m. UK time, another fantastic variety of talks. And if you want even more talking tomorrow, and you're either in the Australian-esque type time zone, or you don't mind getting up a little bit early, Namali, if you want to post a link to your event that's running immediately before the one that we start tomorrow morning, please do feel free to share it. And that will be looking at ESG within the mining sector and differentiations between, say, Australia and the likes of the UK. So lots and lots of fantastic talks to look forward to. We hope to see you all later on today. If you can't stay with us because you amazingly have other things going on in your life, everything has been recorded, and Chris and Kieran and Rose and everybody in the team have been amazing. And I think that all the recordings from yesterday are already online. Is that correct? So go to the website, click on the talks, and you will find all of the talks from yesterday where people have given us their slides. They will be uploaded, etc. as well. So it's a fantastic resource for everybody. So with that, and just to preempt the Fortnum and Mason's clock that will chime its beautiful tune somewhere behind Jeff roundabout now. Thank you very much, everybody. Another fantastic session, and see you later on today. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks,
Cool.
everyone.
Well done, everybody. That was great.
Thank you.
And well done, Olivia. That was great for your first ever talk.
Yeah. Thanks.
Brilliant.
All right.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you later. Bye.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye.